And we are live. Welcome back to Reasoned Answers.
As good as waging war against Allah and His Messenger.
I welcome back David S. And we have a new guest here, Ben Rex. Ben Rex saw a previous presentation by David S. where he presented a kind of a philosophical case for the Trinity, and he had some questions about that. So we're going to get into those questions. Perhaps we'll have an opportunity to take questions from the audience as well. The idea here is that we believe that our beliefs about the scripture, our beliefs about the Trinity hold up to scrutiny, and thus we welcome the most challenging questions that people have. We'll open today with a brief word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time together here today. We are in pursuit of the truth. We want to properly exegete your text. We want to properly understand who you are, understand your nature, understand what kind of God you are. And we ask that you illuminate the truth today, that you help the audience perceive what is true, that you help us perceive what is true, that you help us and guide us in our discussion, that you prevent us from theological error. We ask that whatever that is said is true is remembered and applied to people's lives, and anything that's said that is false is quickly forgotten. I ask that you be with me and my guests on a personal level, that you give us the strength and perseverance for a productive discussion today, and the wisdom to know what to say. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, and a couple of quick announcements as well. So number one, as you can see, the bot is promoting that there is a new animation for today. If you watched the last stream, you saw a preview of that, but that's now available for general use. So if you go over to the website, you can learn about that. Another announcement is that I have someone, so a couple weeks ago in streams, we talked a couple times about possibly hiring a video editor. Someone who I'd worked with in the past contacted me. I'm pretty sure they did actually see that. They were just contacting me for their own reasons. And so I have hired him on a trial basis. If you want to help pay for that so that it doesn't all come out of my pocket, you can visit my Patreon, which is in the video description, or you can set up a reoccurring donation on PayPal. If for some reason you don't like Patreon, that is also available. And there's a subscribe star option too if you want to be different and go that route instead. So I would appreciate it. You should. I had a conversation with him yesterday, kind of got on the same page. So you should start to see a lot of content, shorter form content, not like 60-second shorts, but like 5-10 minute segments from the live streams, extracted out, edited down, tightened up, so that people can get benefit from the stream without watching the entire 2, 3, 6-hour presentation. So I'm very excited about that, and I hope that people find that beneficial. So welcome to my guests, to David S. and to Ben Rex. Ben Rex, why don't you introduce yourself, whatever you want to say, and then David can introduce himself and briefly tell us about what he talked about last time.
Yes, yes, I'm a viewer. I viewed a few videos of yours. I'm from Switzerland, an engineer, and yeah, I don't know if there is much to say. But I assumed you will ask me why I'm a Christian, so I prepared a slide for that. Nothing too big, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go ahead and pull that up now.
Yes. Short answer is basically I grew up as a Christian. My parents were Christians, both of them, and I looked at what the world teaches, like the secular atheistic world and a few other religions, and to me Christianity just makes more sense of everything, and yeah, that's basically it.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfectly good reason, right? That it makes more sense. It better fits the evidence. Great reason to be a Christian. So David's been on here a couple times. Well, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself and then remind the audience or inform them for the first time if they didn't see the original presentation of what you outlined last time.
Yeah, sure thing, sure thing. My name is David S. I'm so glad to be back, and it's wonderful to have Ben here. Also, Ben, I love that answer about why you're a Christian. I think it's so good to have a reasonable approach to Christianity where you see the reasons for it and see that it makes everything make more sense together. So, such a wonderful answer. For my answer as to why I'm a Christian, same way, same thing, you know. I've studied atheistic materialism and metaphysical naturalism, Buddhism and Hinduism slightly, and I've studied all these different world religions, Islam, obviously, and none of them compare to the explanatory power of Christianity. So, you know, right on the same page there. But last time I gave a presentation on the Trinity, and I spoke about it from a philosophical perspective. I tried to really stick with a simple philosophical approach because I realized many times in speaking with Muslims and some other people, they'll say, well, we don't trust your book. Or we don't trust the verses in your book. We don't trust any of the things in your book. And I thought, you know, what would be interesting if I pursued a metaphysical explanation of the Trinity from pure philosophy. Because through a metaphysical approach from pure philosophy, then people who say they reject our book don't really have a good reason, because then they'd also have to reject the logical arguments and philosophy presented. So previously on a PowerPoint that I presented here, I had spoken on the attributes of God, those metaphysical and essential attributes of God, the ones that are proper to his nature. And so pure actuality and ipse esse subsistens, right? That God just is. I talked about his goodness and his love quite a bit. I think the goodness and the love of God are foundational to understanding the personhood or persons of God. And so I presented on that in a prior presentation. But I'm just a Christian who enjoys studying theology. I'm praying someday to make and write and publish written works that can help simplify the more complex data of Christian theology and philosophy. And we have a couple thousand years to simplify, so you know it's going to take a while. But I'm trying to really simplify it for people, and also to show how robust a Christian worldview is. So that's me. That's everything just about that I had wanted to say and talk about there. I'm sure as we go through, Ben and I will have a chance to go through some more of the information relevant to the Trinity presentation and my wild, wacky web of attributes that I had drawn and shown there, that I think is still on Thaddeus's website, or at least it was in a previous
Yes,
live stream.
yes. So there is a link to the original presentation, i.e. the original YouTube presentation, and within that there is a link to the PowerPoint presentation. And I'll get it added to this video's description as well. I didn't think to do that, but I can do that for sure so that people have a reference for that. In fact, I will pull that up here in a second and put it in the chat while I'm not talking next time. I had a couple comments from the audience here. First from Ryan, he says, yo, your brother in Christ, you got a great channel, my friend. I'm a subscriber. If you haven't seen it yet, you need to go and check out the video your brother in Christ put out
So good.
yesterday.
So good.
A+ content on how we can fight Islamic terrorism peacefully. And Hariel says, I am a Christian because nothing else really exists. Hallelujah. FP says, why I am not a Christian? Because many Christians claim to follow the book and don't. I think that's a very interesting statement there. And I would agree with the second part of this, right? That many Christians claim, or many people who claim to be Christians, like they say that they follow the Bible, they say they follow Jesus, and they don't seem to actually do that. Where I would dispute this is whether that's a good reason to believe or disbelieve in something. Because I'm sure whatever belief system you look at, you'll find many people who don't actually follow it. Many people claim to be a Muslim and don't follow their texts. Many people claim to be a Hindu and don't believe in the polytheistic system. They have other ideas. Many people claim to be atheists and don't act like material naturalism is the truth. They act like there's a spiritual reality. They act like there's a higher truth, even though they claim they don't believe that. So I would say don't judge by what people who claim to be something do, but judge by what the actual beliefs of that religion or worldview are. Anything you want to add?
Amen.
All right. I guess that would be a no. So with that, we can go ahead. I'll pull up Ben Rex's presentation here, and we can get started.
Yes, this is an overview of what I want to talk about. First, the goal of the presentation and the conversation, and then about philosophical arguments and what I see its use at or not the use of it. Then a few definitions of what is God. Then the you had two arguments for the Trinity based on love, and the bigger one and the simplified version, those two. Then from the you also had arguments from a personal God on how you reached Trinity, and here I just took one argument of yours and also had an additional thought on the communication aspect of it. And then I want to close everything up with a unrelated question, and it's just a philosophical argument I think makes sense, but I think most Christians disagree with me on that, or at least most Christians I talk to. So yeah, those are the points I want to talk about.
Yep,
Yes.
excellent. Sounds like a good plan there.
Good structure. I like it. Very, very methodical. I like that.
Yeah, it comes along with being an engineer. So now the goal and conduct. I think so I had studied electrical engineering, and so in my electrical engineering path, philosophy was not really a thing. The only thing which could have to do with philosophy is one rhetorics and logic class in our writing practice, and so obviously just binary logic and stuff like this also has some connection to philosophy, but basically everything I have is self-taught or not present at all. And then but thanks to my background and probably also my genetics, I would say I have a decent skill in detecting what is actually a claim and what is the interpretation of facts, and where are the gaps in an argument. So I don't really like the thing which I don't really care about is taking an idea and thinking for it for an entire evening. I just look at it, see if it makes sense or not, and then I'd like to move on. So
Very good.
And I would say in your previous presentation, the philosophical argument is basically you have premises and then a conclusion, and then you can have missing premises, faulty premises, or wrongly drawn conclusion. I would say those are the three major problems one can have, and I would say I didn't detect any missing premises, and I didn't detect any wrong conclusions. But I do think some of the premises are faulty and some of them are redundant. For example, in one premise you had a therefore. It basically, I don't know. This doesn't seem like a separate premise to me, so I would call that a redundancy. But yeah, we will see it when we're in the presentation. And my goal is to focus on the Trinity aspect of it, but if you were not believing in the things you claim. So I don't assume, for example, love is a objective moral good. Like with some people, we can assume that because they have that in their worldview or in their cultural upbringing, but not with everybody. And I won't assume those things. So I'm aware in your previous presentation, for some points, you had that as an assumption. But in this presentation, I will mostly not assume those things. And then, yeah, so sometimes I will argue for points I won't agree with myself because, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I want to see how it is objective and not just the scripture tells me so. I trust it if the scripture tells me so, but I don't think I can convince a consistent atheist with that argument. And
Yep, sounds very
Yeah.
fair. Just a quick note here. Apparently, your brother in Christ and perhaps others, although they won't be hearing me, so this advice is useless, but they were stuck and it didn't realize the presentation had started. He's like, when this starts, and then everyone's like, it started already. So if you have that problem in the future, it's past the, it's more than a couple minutes past, 10 minutes past, say, the proposed start time. Maybe refresh the page just to see if I'm actually that late or if it started without you realizing it because YouTube was not working properly. And then I had a comment here from Una that the cat cam is a great addition. We briefly had Artemis, but she decided to leave us. So hopefully a cat comes back and I'll put that back up on the screen. All right, you can continue on. We got your goals and how you're going to handle things. So if we want to get to the first point, we can.
Well, actually, if I could just.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, for everybody watching, this is a really good way. The way that Ben is working here, right? This is a really good way to approach anything, because any time that you want to analyze a premise or a conclusion that follows from premises, which of course the necessity of one or two premises and a conclusion is necessary for argumentation. What Ben is doing here is excellent, right? Because just as Ben was saying, and a really good book for this, because I'm going through my logic course in my grad school right now, but Socratic Logic from Peter Kraft is amazing. It's such a good book. It deals with Socratic and Aristotelian logical premises and conclusions. It explains how you can make an argument that's necessarily true, which is really, really good, really helpful. And the major components or parts of an argument would be the terms, right? Making sure the terms are clear. So number one is the terms. Number two are the propositions or premises. So those are like your sentences, just as Ben was talking about. And then number three would be your logic, right? And so your premise, your terms can either be clear or unclear. Your premises can either be true or false. In your conclusion, or I'm sorry, your logic, the conclusion itself can either be valid or invalid. And then if you have clear terms, if you have true premises, and if you have a valid conclusion, then the argument is necessarily true. So I just wanted to give a summary of that. Ben did a really good job already talking about that. I just wanted to give a shout out to this book. It's really helpful. All right, go ahead, Ben, with the next couple slides. I just wanted to give you a good commendation because you did a great job on setting that up, and that's a good example for everybody else.
Yes. First, I want to have two basically arguments on philosophy or on philosophical arguments. So first premise is, yeah, basically what you just stated. You have premises, conclusions, and how they interact. Then second premise is, if we miss a premise, then the conclusion might be void. And then third is, every person has a worldview, and therefore the biases and blind spots which go along with that worldview. And so, as a conclusion, I would say it's not, or the way I view it is, it is not actually possible to be certain on a point just because we have a philosophical argument, because I always assume I have blind spots. So that's why I personally don't put too much weight into philosophical arguments. What would you say on that?
Yeah, so I would say, and I understand where you're coming from, right? As a matter of fact, even in Peter Kreeft's writing in Socratic Logic, he says the most difficult part of argumentation is the question of if a premise is true or false. That's the most difficult part. Because with the logic of an argument, if it's logically valid, you can do that pretty easily, right? You can be like, that's a fallacy here. There's something that's not following. So the logical argument of it is the easier part. The terms also, making sure they're clear and defined, that stuff's easy. The premises being true or false, that's the tricky part. Now, of course, since you used a philosophical argument to make this argument, I would say that, in a certain sense, you do believe that there is good value to argumentation using a philosophical structure, since that is the argument itself. But I would also say that there is a possibility of philosophical certainty. Now, how certain we can be about that certainty is a different question that gets into a different discussion on epistemology. But I'll say it like this. We can assume an argument to be certain until one of the premises has been shown to be false. Sometimes, because I think you're correct the way you're approaching this, sometimes people say, since we cannot know forever if our premises are actually true, therefore we can never be truly certain. But I think that there is a sense in which if nobody is able to show why a premise is wrong, then we could at least assume it's certain until somebody else finds a way through, finds an issue with it. So I would say that there is a potential certainty, but it's a humble certainty. I want to say it like that. It's a humble certainty that's waiting for someone to show why one of the premises is false. But until then, we can assume it's certain. So that's the one little caveat or one little addition I'd have there. But I agree. People do have blind spots, and that's why it's a humble certainty. We know it's possible we missed something. But that's great. That's great.
That sounds good. I for one, I used the way of formulating this as an argument because it's a philosophy communication now. So it's a way of adjusting myself to the situation, and also a bit to tease you. But yeah, I would agree there, and I think philosophical arguments have, at the very least, the value of making thoughts clearer, and so I would say that's certainly a point. And one little thing I would disagree with you. You said until a premise is shown to be wrong, we can have a potential certainty. But one thing which people who think logically often miss is that sometimes people think, or there is a large group of people who think intuitionally, with the intuition, and they can have a very correct statement. And if you ask them how they come to the conclusion, they will give you a completely bullshit reason for it. And so it's just because sometimes we notice that the conclusion has to be wrong, and we can't pinpoint a premise which is faulty. So I'm not I'm not going all the way there, as you said, but yeah.
Well said. Well said. And I would agree. Intuition is valuable. I actually think intuition is very valuable and can be a good way of knowing certain things in a way that's not illogical. But to quote Dr. Michael Guillen in his book, Believing is Seeing, it's supralogical or it's translogical. It goes beyond it. So I'd say that there is good value to intuition. Good value.
I think I've heard somebody say any philosophical thought if you go question it deep enough, it will go back to an intuition, something like this. And I think that makes sense. Yeah.
So, quick comment unrelated to this discussion, but I wanted to address it. So, electronic hype comes in here. I'm guessing he's a Muslim. Says he should use the Bible as firewood. Go right ahead, electronic hype. As long as it's your Bible that you paid money for, bought at a store, it's your possession. Go ahead and burn it. Use it as firewood. Do whatever else you want to it. Christians do not treat the Bible as if it was their God. Therefore, it doesn't bother us. You burn some paper that has words of the Bible printed on it, go right ahead. I couldn't care less. Because my God is the living God who is master of the universe and lives inside me. So do what you want with the text.
I have
And
a
look at
small
that, they'd
recommendation.
be using it for warmth and life. So they'd be showing that the Bible is very good for sustaining and preserving life. Amen. Look at that.
Yeah, and I would recommend before you burn a page, read it first, and then you can burn it. And then do it with every page you burn.
That's a good idea. That
suggestion.
is genius. Ben, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's right. Make sure that there's no Arabic, because there might be Arabic from the Quran in those pages of the Bible. So make sure to read the entire thing before you burn it, just to make sure.
And then one relevant comment here from Hankaroo. Assumptions never lead to certainty. The conclusions will only be as good as the assumptions/premises. And I think that we're all in agreement on principle here, but no one will live their life that way. And, no one will go around their day-to-day life and say, I just don't know anything about anything because I can't be certain. So it's more like, as David put it, this tentative certainty, where we have what we call certainty, but we have the also in our mind the idea that we could be wrong and we could adjust our position in light of new evidence. And I think that's the position that everyone should have. I think that this is something that, say, atheists claim they do, but don't actually do. that they have assumptions about the world, and then they force all the evidence to match those assumptions. And Christians obviously can do this, Muslims can do this, anyone can do this. But only one particular group, I find, usually is in the position where they think, oh, absolutely, we're the ones with no assumptions whatsoever, and that would be atheists. So I would encourage people to, to have confidence in what they believe, but be open to the possibility of new evidence proving them wrong.
Amen.
Yes, and by the way, this statement is, or this argument I used as a way to push back. In conversations, I like to take the stance of the opposite side. So as long as it's still somewhat reasonable. So sometimes I don't hold as strong of a view as it might appear in a conversation. So yeah, just wanted to point it out.
You're just like me. I do the same thing. I actually like to, for my work, I actually need to, but I do enjoy and find it valuable to present a question against myself or against something somebody else has offered, just to see if I'm missing something. So I actually think it's really helpful to just kind of imagine what it would be like to be somebody else. What a wonderful comment. Jesus is, well, I'd say Jesus is God, but I get what they're saying. He isn't bothered with you burning his book the way your false prophet warlord is. That, amen. Yes, exactly. Right? We don't worry about that. He literally
And
owns all of creation.
yeah, so I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you already read that comment there, electronic hype demonstrates how you can have a logical fallacy or poor thought. He said, watch your words. Didn't David go to war? So let's say, for example, that hypothetically speaking, David was a warlord. Don't think that's an accurate description, but let's say he was. Well, there was two statements about Muhammad there, false prophet and warlord. So just disputing that warlord's a bad thing doesn't actually answer Justin's comment in any way.
Yeah, this would be
All
an
right.
example of a tu quoque fallacy where he's saying, well, you too, which doesn't actually do anything to drive any conversation forward ever, number one.
Yep.
And number two, again, this is an equivocation fallacy, right? Treating King David as some sort of equal moral exemplar to Muhammad. We don't look at King David as a perfect moral exemplar, right? We look at Jesus as a perfect moral exemplar. So to randomly compare someone who we don't use as a moral exemplar to somebody who the Quran and your Hadith say you must treat as the perfect moral example is a complete equivocation fallacy, right? So again, yeah, hey now, you can't talk about a prophet going to war when David said, again, this is so strange. I'm sorry, Ben. I'm sorry. I don't want to derail it too much, but just a quick statement. Equivocation fallacies are the most egregious and most common of fallacies. And when you're not able to see how you're equivocating between incomparable premises, right? Or at the very least, ones that are just not similar, then it shows that you haven't really thought about your claims and you're just regurgitating information that's irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to make a comparable comparison or like a reasonable comparison, you would have to compare Muhammad to Jesus. That would be a realistic example. That would be a good comparison. However, you want to know why they're not doing that? Because they have an underlying straw man fallacy. Look how fallacious this reasoning is. They're specifically going after someone that no Christians look at as a perfect moral example in order to try to make some sort of moral equivalency between Islam and Christianity to kind of substantiate their tu quoque fallacy, right? The amount of fallacies in this little mindset is wild. So, since I know you would never actually try to make the comparison between Jesus and Muhammad, because you know the moment you do, you'll see how much greater Jesus is in every way morally. Of course, you'll go to King David, which, by the way, us as Christians can say, yeah, King David made some mistakes. I don't know if going to war is a mistake because I think he's quite justified in whatever they had to do. But he made some other mistakes that are very serious, extremely serious. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly respond. Don't want to take
and just to point out the fallacy here in a different way, you're suggesting that because David went to war, or because other people went to war, we can't judge Muhammad going to war. Therefore, because Muhammad went to war, you can't judge other people going to war, which means you, for example, can't say anything against Israel right now. So I would like you to put into the chat that you're right. I can't say anything negative about Israel because they are just doing what Muhammad did. And we'll see if you think that that is actually logically equivalent. Now, I don't think it is, but by your argument, they are logically equivalent. So you need to say that in the chat. All right, let's get back to the Trinity.
Yes, although it's not quite the Trinity yet, the next slide is still not about the Trinity. Here, I have seen it on people's channel before, but a way in which philosophical arguments shouldn't be used. Basically, if I just summarize it very shortly, if we use it in a conversation, this basically means we don't agree, and therefore we have different assumptions. And sometimes we miss an assumption because we don't even think about stating it, and so we miss a premise. And so if we want to use it to convince a person of an argument within a heated conversation, then that will I don't like that approach because I don't think it is really productive. Then you might be able to corner somebody, but it's not possible in that setup to use philosophical arguments in a correct way. But yeah, I didn't see you do that. I just saw it before, and I wanted to mention it.
Yeah, I depending, because I do understand what you're saying. I think depending on the way it's used, it can be very effective. Because I know implicitly you actually imported a premise, a hidden premise in this when you're talking about it, right? Which is like shouting or aggressive when it's like an aggressive argument conversation, uh, and when it's when people are being belligerent or trying to back somebody into a corner. Now, of course, that's not in your philosophical arguments, but those would be some of your unspoken premises that you speak about when you're talking about it, which is ironic. Uh,
Yes.
but I would say this: I agree with the spoken premises you delivered, not so much with the written ones on the screen, but with your spoken ones, where people try to use it to back somebody into a corner. If that's your only goal, right? If somebody, because it's really a heart matter, right? It's a matter of intent. If someone's only goal is to destroy somebody, you see that you want to destroy them with philosophical arguments or something, then there is something very much so lost there. Uh, because then you don't really care about the person and about helping them to actually see the truth, right? Or the significance of the argument, following logically from the premises and the conclusion. Instead, you're just trying to trick somebody or trying to show them that you're so much smarter and stuff. So when people do that with philosophical arguments, I would say there is an issue. And I would say that those people with those intents and with those intentions should not approach conversations with philosophical arguments, because their desire is not really to show someone the truth, but just to make somebody feel foolish or stupid. So number one, in those cases, I would agree. I would agree with that. And you see this with, obviously, I'm sure, Ben, you've seen this with Muslim apologists quite a bit, where they're like, you're destroyed, boy, you're destroyed, right? And they don't actually care about trying to really win somebody over. Not in the slightest. They just want to destroy somebody. They want to obliterate them, to make a mockery out of them. And that's just not effective. I agree with you completely. That is not effective at all. But I have found a great deal, both in my work and my other jobs and in my conversations with people. I have found really fruitful conversations with philosophical arguments, and I mean arguments logically, not like, shouting or something. With philosophical arguments, I've seen it very effective in love, right? Kind of like 1 Corinthians 13, if you do all this in love, then it's meaningful. And I think I have evidence that some people have been really impacted and have had their worldviews challenged, and some of them have changed their entire worldview to a more Christian one, or fully to a Christian worldview as a result. And so I think your spoken but not written premises are really valuable here.
I
It's really
disagree.
okay.
Last half sentence of premise 5 is when pressed on the spot. So what I spoken, I have written in premise 5. I should have more clearly focused it on this, but yeah, I can see that. But sometimes, for example, if I'm in a conversation, I tend to not think as well as when I'm alone. So sometimes I need to sleep overnight to think about it, gain a bit of distance. So this is basically in a conversation, like if you just have one conversation, and it might be heated a bit, or sometimes not even needed. But yeah, so
Yeah, I hear that.
this is just a small point. This is not really just a side point. So now let's come to the more interesting part, the definitions. I like the way you distinguish between attributes and characteristics. I didn't write down a summary, so if you want to, you could give a summary again of these. David?
Yeah, I can do that right here. Let me go. I actually have that PowerPoint right around here. There we go. Okay. What do we mean by attributes, characteristics? And this is actually in reference to Dr. Norman Geisler's Systematic Theology, Volume 2. I think that's one of the sources
Who
I used
ate
for
the
this.
apple?
Also, I love that animation. That's amazing. It grows into many trees. So I think this book was being used at the time along with Brian Davies' book, The Thoughts of Thomas Aquinas. So again, the definitions I had were characteristics are traits predicated, that means described or attributed to God relative to his creation, like sovereignty, transcendence, eminence, omnipresence, ineffability. Attributes, on the other hand, are essential to God's nature, even without any creatures with whom he could relate, without any created things or anything like that. So these essential attributes are always true of God, and they are true of God's one divine essence in a way that also starts to combine with the other attributes. So that's the source for that.
Yeah.
And
So,
since you paused, I'll say that Professor Yoffel triggered the apple animation as the first one to do so. And when eating an apple yet? Nope, you are the first. And as the first to trigger a new animation, you get 1,000 points, which is what you spent on it. So basically, you got a refund. All right, continuing on.
yes, and now about the question about those two words. How do you actually determine if something is an attribute or a characteristic?
Oh, that's excellent. That is a great question. So, number one, a lot of these you can understand to be attributes versus characteristics, depending on if they require something in creation, right? So, for instance, creation is time, space, and matter. So, since creation is time, space, and matter, that's the universe, then we would understand God to be timeless because he existed beyond creation, right? So, if time, space, and matter, then we know God is timeless, spaceless, immaterial. And so the attributes that require space, like omnipresence, omnipresence technically requires space, right? In the sense that you can't be everywhere at once if there's not a specific place or space to be. And so you need space for God to be omnipresent in that sense. Or you need a creation for God to be transcendent above the creation. You need a creation for God to be sovereign over the creation, right? And so a lot of these are understood from, just thinking through and removing. We call this the via negativa, the way of negation or of removal. And Christian scholars for the past couple, even Jewish scholars actually, like Moses Maimonides, for the past couple thousand years have been saying, if we remove certain things in creation, then we can know the God who is independent of creation wouldn't need these attributes. He wouldn't need these as attributes. They'd just be characteristics that we experience compared to an attribute. So an attribute, as you have here, is essential to God's nature. So it's something that is in God that he wouldn't need his creation to be. And I will say also a really important thing throughout church history and philosophical history is if the Bible makes a description of God in a way that sounds essential, it sounds like it is his nature or it is who he is, then we usually give that more weight and we're more likely to think about that as being essential to God's nature. Like 1 John 4:8 and 1 John 4:16. In those verses, it says God is love, which is really strange, but it's true. That's what the scripture says. God is love. And so since it speaks of that in a very essential way, just saying God is love in a very clear way, then we would say that love must be essential to God's nature in that sense. So I think that's a really good question. How we determine it's either the via negativa, the way of negation, negating what we have in creation in a certain sense, to see how God could be independent from it, or just from those Bible passages that talk about his essence in a non-metaphorical way.
So I did have a question from a Muslim here, and since they identified as a Muslim, asked if they could ask a question, and then it did so very politely. I do want to bring it up here. He said, so why does God not reference the Trinity when he made the first commandment and when God taught monotheism? It's just a question I had on my mind.
Great question. Look at that. That's so well put. So why does God not reference the Trinity when he made the first commandment and when God taught monotheism? Well, that's because God, being a Trinity, doesn't break the first commandment or monotheism, right? So when God teaches monotheism and the first commandment, that's because those are true, right? That there is one God. That is a fact of reality. That's something that we've established. And monotheism, again, teaches there is one God. First commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. That is true because we believe as Christians that he is one God. So God doesn't need to refer to the Trinity because the Trinity affirms that there is one God. It's just that one God exists as three persons. So I think this person is equivocating between person and being. We agree that there is one being, one God. That one God exists as three persons, right? And so God doesn't have to bring up the Trinity when he teaches about monotheism because those are not contradictory claims. Good question. Good question.
Yeah, and I would say that the Trinity is taught throughout the Bible, from Genesis through Revelation. It's taught in various ways. Now, the word Trinity isn't used. That's a label that we came up later to explain the theology taught by the Bible in a one-word term. If you want to throw out the term, fine. But the ideas that are encompassed in the Trinity are taught throughout the Bible. So continuing on with you, Ben Rex.
I have also Proverbs. In the Proverbs 25:2, it says, "It's the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings to search out a matter." So I think God wants people to seek out basically God and how he created the world. And so he wants initiative of us. And so he implied it in the Bible. In the beginning, it is more it's less obviously implied, and the more it goes on, time goes on, the more things he reveals. So yeah, that would be my two cents on that question.
I like it.
Yeah, and going back to the presentation, here I will skip the question before and go directly to this here. You explained in the Divine Simplicity slide that a lot of God's attributes are negation of existing things like finite and infinite. And how can we check if these negations of things we use in daily life, if they still make a coherent image, especially since they are basically outside of our
Who ate the
field
apple?
of intuition?
Just continue on.
Yeah.
Yes, the question finished.
Yeah. That's excellent. I think that is a wonderful, wonderful question. As a matter of fact, this is a question that is addressed really well in, again, Brian Davies' Thoughts of Thomas Aquinas, who deals exactly with this. Because the question of a coherent image is something that, I'll just keep this here, I might need that later. The question of a coherent image is interesting when it comes to the nature of God, right? A coherent image is an image that works together, right? Coheres, kind of like glue or different parts. So there's nothing wrong with using the via negativa, right? The way of negation, as long as those ways of negation don't contradict each other. We can have a coherent image of God by removing these limits that are, imposed on human beings. And so as long as those negations don't start to logically contradict, then we still have a coherence as in an acceptable understanding of God in a basic sense. Now, I will say this, because this is a great question. As Christians, we do hold, I'll speak for myself much more clearly. I do hold that the transcendence of God, is necessary given the fact that he is the one true God. So I will say that we have a coherent, superficial image of God, but we can't fully comprehend and fully understand the depths of God's nature. And in that sense, there are mysteries that are present to God. And I think that's a good thing. I do think that it's a good thing that even if we have a coherent image of God, we don't have a super clearly accessible image of God, right? As kings search out the things of God, so do we through this method. And so I would simply say the way of negation doesn't make something less coherent because it helps us to at least know those things that we're not talking about, right? For instance, if I were to talk about a film that I really liked, or one aspect of a film I really liked, and someone who has never seen the film, never seen the franchise even, says, "Oh, so I don't know. I'll go through Inception. Inception's an interesting movie. I'm talking about this scene where they're inside of a dream, inside of a dream, inside of a dream, and time's going really slowly, and it's amazing, and there's so many layers deep." And a friend of mine who's never even heard of it and doesn't know about all the weird time stuff that happens in dreams, they're like, "Oh, so is it like Star Wars?" I'm like, "Well, no, it's not. It's not like Star Wars." And they're like, "So there's not some sort of battle between these enemy forces?" I'm like, "No, not any type of like huge battle." And they're like, "Oh, maybe it's like Lord of the Rings." I'm like, "Well, no, there's not any like deep theological import in Inception." And they're like, "Oh, maybe it's like Invincible." I'm sorry, not Invincible. The Incredibles. I was thinking of the cartoon Invincible. No, maybe it's like The Incredibles. You have these superpowered. I'm like, "Well, no, it's not like that." And so at the very least, you start to see, and then I start to add positive descriptions after the negative ones. So several negation is helpful to get a general idea of what something might be. Positive descriptions allow us to have a more clear sense of what it is. And so I think these two things have to work together. Ways of negation and positive descriptions, actual descriptions. Like 1 John 4:8 says God is love. There's no negation there. That's just as positive and clear a claim as you can get. And of course, John chapter 3, where Jesus says, God is spirit, right? So I think that you have to have both methods together in order to start to get a more acceptable, or at least, a clear image of God. But we should expect the transcendence of God to always be there. He's always transcendent, so we'll never have a comprehensive view of God. If that answers the question. I don't know if it did.
I think it did.
So with that, let me take a quick thing from the chat here. There's an individual who's been saying all kinds of strange things, Andy Young. This one, however, made sense. Most of his comments, I even said that I have no idea what you're trying to tell me. He's just saying like really weird things. I think they're all intended to hint at the same idea. How can you understand philosophy? Is it grounded, solid, and undeniable to facts? He keeps like saying these weird things like, is it a C, SEA, or is it a C, capital C? And it's like, I don't know what that means, but I know what this means. So basically, he's basically asking the question that Pilate asked. What is truth? How can you know what is true and what is not?
That's great. That's a great question. Well, foundational to logic and philosophy is the assumption that there are some realities that are just true by definition. They're called philosophical tautologies, which in logic, some tautologies, things that are just true by definition of what they are acceptable, right? Like the laws of logic, right? The laws of logic are just by definition true, right? Because that's how they are. They work in every system. We discover them. Historically, they're not a thing that you made because they're a thing that apply in every situation ontologically too. So the laws of logic, the realities of mathematics, are very much so functional tautologies. They're facts of reality that we discover and notice and can even use because they're practical. So we would say that if there's these groundings for certain laws, like the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics, and the laws of thinking like that, then we could say that there's a grounding for philosophical thought that works in line with logic. If it works in line with logic, then we could say that there's a type of grounding in the laws that they're presupposing or that they're assuming, right? Are we assuming the laws of logic are true? Yes, but that's because the laws of logic are true. So, you could call it an assumption, but it's an assumption that's almost necessarily true. And so, yeah, I'd say they're grounded. Oh, runaway AI bot. Never mind. Okay, maybe it's not worth it.
No, I don't think he really is. But there's like weird random statements like this. When given timeline, urgency and objective are clear, I bet you all be peeing in your pants. So it's like, what the heck is this guy even going on about? But I think whether he's listening or not, I think that was a good question to be asked, related to what you said a few slides ago. So I wanted to bring it up. All right, let's continue on with the slides.
Yes, I think I got an answer for that one. So I will go to the next point. In the previous presentation, you mentioned that evil is a lack of good, and in the framework of Christianity, I can totally stand behind that. But is there objective argumentation for that? So if I talk to somebody who is, let's say, somebody who grew up with Star Wars and thinks that evil and good has to always be in a balance. So if there is a lot of good, then somebody has to commit a lot of evil to balance it out. How would you convince such a person that evil is a lack of good?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Because I've had so much wide acceptance from people in different backgrounds when I speak about evil as a privation, or this kind of lacking in the wholeness of good. It's very rare that anybody will ever push back on that. But I would say this. I would say that there is a way in conversation to help people at least see that the Christian view is more consistent and coherent than other depictions of evil. That might be a better approach. Because I agree that, it can be difficult for someone outside of a Christian worldview to just, or in theory, it would be difficult for someone to just hop into our same thinking about evil. But I think that this offers a better, more consistent image of evil, because when you look at other descriptions of evil, let's say someone says that evil is just whatever we describe things that we don't like. So if someone says that, then I would say, okay, are there, what if someone says that they like to assault people? They like to assault people. And they'd say, oh, well, that wouldn't be good. And I'm like, well, but they like to. And so evil is only applied to things that you don't like. And so that person would say, oh, well, then it would be good for them and evil according to me. To which I would say, okay, so what's your actual definition? And the person would say, okay, evil is whatever we personally wish to say are the things that we like and we call good things. I'm sorry. Evil is what we say of the things we personally dislike, and good is the stuff we say of the things we personally like. So this is a part of Andrew Fisher. There it is. Andrew Fisher's book, Metaethics, where he talks about this. It's called non-cognitivism. Really, really interesting introduction. So then I would ask, okay, is that corresponding with, or is that consistent with the reality we see around us? Because I think if they say that, then I would say, is that how we react? Do we really act and believe as if that's true? And I mean that just across the board, right? If someone breaks into somebody's house, into let's say someone broke into my house and they started, killing my family, my natural intuitive human response would not be, oh no, that person's doing something that they enjoy doing, and I'm seeing them do something that I don't enjoy seeing them do. Well, no, that's not how my brain works, and that's not how anybody really approaches situations of evil. People approach it with this sense that it's the way things should not be, that there's something wrong, that there's this thing people are appealing to, and they're like, this just isn't right. And it's not just a matter of how they feel about it, but or even how I feel about it, but it's the way that things should be, and they're going against the way things should be. So what I usually do with people is I walk them through their definition of evil, and I try to see if it's more consistent with reality than mine is. And I have found that nobody offers as consistent a description of evil in reality than the Christian position. You know, for Muslims, if you actually get into the discussion with them, they'll say, or at least for philosophical Muslims, I mean, then they'll say, well, you know, Allah does will all things to come to pass exactly as they come to pass without question. So he wills evil. So I'll say, okay, so evil is what Allah wills. And they'll say yes. And I'll say, what about good? They're like, that's what Allah wills. And I'll say, so evil is what Allah wills. Premise 1. Premise 2. Good is what Allah wills. Premise 3. Therefore, good equals evil. Is good evil and evil good in the Islamic worldview? And they'll say, well, from the human, philosophical Muslims, I'm sure the average Muslim would not know about this, but if it's only good and evil in our perspective, but it's totally the exact same thing in Allah's perspective, then aren't we just kind of living a lie? Because I would think that Allah knows the truth of things more than humans do. So wouldn't good and evil just be like random illusions we make up about stuff? And in a sense, you know, they would say, oh, well, no, because Allah gives us moral commands. So therefore, there must be something Allah wants people to do. I'm like, what does he want them to do, the good or the evil? And they'll say, even if I disagree with their definitions of good and evil, they'll say, well, he wants us to do what's good. I'm like, okay, so he wants the good, but he wills the evil, right? So long way of saying, ask them what their definition of evil is and goodness is. See if it's consistent with reality. And when you start to see that it's not, then you can offer the Christian perspective of evil being a privation of good. If you want, you could say something's here that's not being where it should be, right? So when a gunman breaks into a house, it's good that this is a human being who has an intellect and a will, right? This is a human being, so it's good that a thing exists. And it's good that they even have the power to, you know, if they needed to, do something of great strength. But what's empty, what's missing, that privation, that pothole in the road, is that this person's using it in a way that they shouldn't, right? To kill a helpless family. And so now you have something that's there, the rest of the road, this person, but then you have this thing missing. There's something missing. And I think that at least it feels like it fits the intuitions better. And it feels like it's more consistent with reality as a whole. That's what I would say. But do you think it's effective in conversation with people, or do you think it still wouldn't be?
I think it makes a lot of sense if you talk to post-Christians, new atheists, and Muslims. But if you talk to a hardcore eugenics guy, or a Confucianist probably as well, or a Roman Stoic or whatever, I don't actually know, but I assume they have a way better thought through idea of good and evil, and then this point wouldn't work anymore.
Yeah,
you just have a weak opposition basically. So, and then I agree, if those people accept logic, then that's a good approach to take. But it's basically the argument invalidating their point of view doesn't make yours correct.
Oh, for sure. No, that's I think you're exactly right. This is one of the big issues with a view of apologetics called presuppositionalism. It's a type of approach that's not always wrong, but often it assumes certain realities and then assumes everybody else should think that way. In their hearts, they actually do think that way. But I do know, and I've met people who are hardcore eugenicists, and I've met some Taoists and Confucianists who kind of go away from the idea of evil being this lack of good, even though Taoism really should embrace that. But many Taoists don't. I would say even for the eugenicist, they're actually still upholding this definition. Like Mr. Singer over in whatever that Ivy League school is, and other people who are really into like eugenics, they would actually say, oh, well, the presence of these diseased people in our society that are less than are actually what they're doing is they're taking what should be a good society and they're taking something out of it, right? Which, of course, is a very perverted way of thinking about human beings. But oddly enough, they're actually still applying the same definition in their framework, in their worldview. Stoicism, as weird as it is still actually using this definition as an original premise, right? Because then they're thinking about the finding ways to fill the hole. Stoicism finds a way to fill the hole or avoid the hole by saying, you accept all of reality as is. But of course, in Stoicism, to accept all of reality as it is in the pain that comes and the suffering that comes with it is to still accept the fact that there's pain and suffering, to embrace the fact that there's things that will be difficult, and therefore this is how you should respond to those realities. So in a weird way, I think all of those views are presupposing this idea of privation, or at least the idea of privation works into those views. I think there's a way to show that, we're not inconsistent here. This view actually could work in your worldview. It could. And so I think that's another way to go about it, to show that there's no contradiction.
Okay, but so it can't be basically this argument, evil is a lack of good, can't be used as a premise because if you are with a person who is who wants to build everything from ground up, this can't be used as a premise because it's an assumption based on our worldview and not. To me, it sounds like you didn't offer an objective reason for it. You just compared which is most likely to be true, which is a good methodology. But if I would build an argument on that premise, then this could be a weak point.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying. I think I'd have to know what you mean about building an objective case for this definition of evil as a lack of good, right? Because if I wanted to, I could state that being is the way things are, and that goodness is the metaphysical grounds for the way things, goodness is the grounds for the way things should be, because everything is around being. And that when things are not the way they should be, going back to being, because we at least know that things exist, so that's an assumption that everybody can accept, then you could say that goodness being the way things should be, you just show evil to be a lack in the way things should be. So I guess I'd have to ask what the difficulty is in using this definition if it's consistent by the end of it.
I would. Is it? I guess I will have to ask it like this. So the way you formulated that question sounds to me like it's a conclusion doesn't require the premises to be objectively true. They just have to be consistent. Everything has to be consistent so that the conclusion is true. Did I understand you correctly, or did I formulate it in a way that is understandable?
I hear what you're saying. I don't know if that's exactly what I was going for. I'm saying consistency is a necessary part of it in order for it to be a valid conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we actually want to see if it's like necessarily true, then we'd have to prove the premises to be true, right? So because of course, if one of the premises is not knowably true, then the conclusion might be true. It might not be true in reality. We don't know. And again, that's Peter Craig's book on logic. So in my understanding of it, following the rules of logical thought, if it's true, if that is a true description of reality, then we can accept that. Now, you're probably asking, how can we know that to be true? To which I would say that you would need other arguments before this or along with this in order to get that point across. So if you were to make an argument about the nature of, the existence of God, then I think an argument from the existence of God, showing that God follows logically from those conclusions, cosmological argument, whatever you want to do, you can actually use that as an argument before this one in order to explain the nature of God as being real. And then whatever God is, right, from that truth, then we can understand what evil would be. So I think this could be a good argument, trying to logically talk about with somebody if you have an argument beforehand, an argument about God. So I think an argument from God would be needed to understand this argument about evil.
Yes. I guess this is a good point to end this point. I just want to make a small side question, statement, whatever. In the last stream, you said evil is the lack of good, and as an argument for it, not really argument, but you told the story of the road with plot holes, and I would say it's, if you tell a story, then it's just to make it more understandable, but it's not an argument for it, because I can invent a story to argue for any point. So I assume you agree with that.
No, that's fair. I think stories are just good analogies to help get the idea across. So I would agree with that. I think stories don't count as arguments, but they are helpful little lessons or images to get the conclusion across.
Yeah, and humans are both rational and emotional, and sometimes we need the emotions to catch up to the logic. So yeah, I just wanted to mention it because I'm a bit sensitive to this aspect. If you appeal to just emotion or rhetorics or storytelling or whatever and use that as an argument, I see that even in science debates and stuff like this. So I'm a bit sensitive to that. So I wanted to point it out.
Yeah, I wasn't using it at the time as an argument per se, but only as a way to help people understand the way that Christians have thought about evil for a long time. So it was more just an example to help people understand what I meant by evil being a privation of good, and not an argument in and of itself. That's a good thing to point out. Just because somebody makes a claim doesn't mean a claim is an argument. And so Ben is correct in pointing out that fact.
Yes, I thought it would be that case. I just wanted to point it out. Yeah. So next question, God is perfect. I assume, for me it's obvious because the Bible says so. And a lot of theists also think that God is perfect. But to me, if I try to view it from an objective standpoint, does God have to be perfect to be the creator of the universe? Or, I mean, some aspects he needs to be. For example, he needs to be, I think you used the word eternal, as in outside of time. So this, for me, it's clear that he has to be this, but does he have to be perfect, and does he have to be perfect in all attributes, or does it suffice to be just greater than the universe?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, that's an interesting approach to it. So there are some people I've heard who have talked about God just as being the greatest being rather than a perfect being. I've heard people say that before. The reason, though, well, okay, number one, let's define what I mean by perfect. That's actually a really good place to start first.
Oh, yeah. Good.
So, because otherwise, definitions before everything else. So,
Yes.
perfect. When we're applying that to God, when we're talking about God in terms of perfection, we're talking about all that He is. He is without fault, or without lack, right? So that's what we mean by perfect. There's a sense of fullness, wholeness, and completion in God, so that whatever He is, He completely is, right? Which also was on one of my slides previously, I think. And so that's what we mean by perfect. For whatever God is, essentially, what exactly as you have it there, why do we think God is perfect in all His essential attributes? It's because whatever God is, He is the standard of it. Like, there is no standard beyond God, right? I think under the assumption that God exists, we would understand that there's no assumption beyond God, because if there is, then that standard would be God, right? So if God is the source and standard and there's nothing beyond Him, then we'd have to say He is what perfection is, because there's nothing else He's trying to attain, or He's not trying to grow or improve or something, because there's no standard that He's reaching out to outside of Himself. And so in that's what I would say is an understanding of perfection, that there's no standard above or beyond God that He's trying to attain, that He needs to attain in order for Him to be better than He already is. As He is exactly how He is, without a standard above Him. Does that definition of perfection make sense?
It makes sense. I think I had to think about. I think the Mormons, do they believe that God was a person who became God and created the universe? And so
Yes.
I think there are alternative views which are plausible or possible or whatever. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Actually, for a couple of years now, I've been studying Mormonism just to better understand it when the missionaries come by. So you're right. With Mormonism, they do say that Elohim, which is their understanding of God the Father, or Heavenly Father, as they'll say, used to live on a planet next to a star called Kolob. And on this planet next to Kolob, he was a man. He was born from his own God and his own spiritual mother and spirit father and spirit heaven that gave birth to him on this planet. And he lived as a man on that planet. And then he lived a perfect moral life in accordance with his God's instructions. And then because of that, then he became a God because he followed the instructions of his God. And then he had his own spirit wife and they had their own spirit kids, all that. So the way that Mormons get around the nature of God being perfect, that there's no standard beyond Him, is they say, oh, well, we just have an infinite regress of gods in time, which is, here's the issue. You can't have an infinite number of regret going backwards, of gods in time, because time has not always existed, right? So you'll come to a point where you'll have somebody at the beginning of the universe who either was the one true infinite ultimate God, that I think some Mormons hold to this idea that, there's like this original God type wisdom, or there's like this type of wisdom that guides everything to being better and better. And so they'll say that there's this thing at the beginning. Other ones will just say, oh, we don't know. They'll say this has not been revealed to us, so we don't know about it. But in their case, they still hold to whatever that guiding principle is, whatever that thing is before all these gods. You have their own gods, you have their own gods. Whatever this original thing is, it itself would be perfect because it's the thing that's driving everything in the universe towards perfection. Each god is worshiping that god, and each god that's worshiping a god would be worshiping that god too, right? So in their understanding of it, that original thing is still perfect because it's the thing that's driving everything else to become more perfect. God bless you. So that's how the Mormons would go about that. I wonder how the Muslims would go about that. That's interesting to think about, actually. I'm trying to think how a Muslim would go about the question of God being perfect, because I think, I'm not sure, Ben, you'd probably agree with me. I'm guessing a Muslim would say that Allah is perfect.
We can just ask them. They are in the comments.
Oh wait, that's right. Yeah, that's a good point. Muslims in the comments, go ahead and let us know if Allah is perfect. If Allah is perfect,
And what the definition of perfect is.
yes, good point. Good point. Yeah, put down if you think Allah is perfect, and then explain what perfection means when you say it of Allah. That's cool. I'm hoping to see those comments. But yeah, Mormons are interesting. Very interesting. Their infinite backwards lineup of gods, because they would still hold to perfection, but only perfection for that original thing, not for all the other things.
I think that makes a sense, that response. You made me think of first. I once watched a natural theology video, I think, and there they said not just infinite regress in time, but infinite regress in logical causes, and so they made it an even stronger argument. But and another thing, I like to read Chinese fantasy novels. Only read them if you have enough time, because they are huge. And they, I've noticed that they have a weakness. They know how to make long stories, but they are incapable of ending the story, because they have basically the endless improvements. And this is great if you love world building, because then they are forced to introduce new worlds and new environments and new characters, and that's awesome. But the way they end the story, they can either just say, now the universe ends and the person is suddenly happy without striving for progress and without challenging the heaven. That's one way I saw that a story ended, which is very inconsistent with the character. Then another version which you can end it is basically he explored the entire universe and found out that that there is a universe beyond that, and now the story ends. That's another way I saw how a story could end. And I think there are two logical ways in which you can end it, and I have never seen them implemented. One story is one way is, the character dies. I think that's the most logical one. He basically did some kind of cultivation method or whatever, which caused a weakness in his body, and once he achieved his goal, he dies. And so I think that's the most consistent way such a story can end. That's probably also a criticism of Taoism in general. And another way which they can't use, but if I were capable of writing a book, I would do it. It's basically the idea that there is a person who basically explores the universe until its end and finds that it's a closed system. And then he starts to think, what am I missing? And starts to explore everything. And then he noticed that there are small churches by the mortal people. And then he noticed that if you want to exit this closed system, you basically have to die, not just your body, but your soul entirely. And then you can either enter heaven or hell, basically, depending on if you choose to be with God or not. So that would be a logically consistent story with a logically consistent end. and it would, yeah, that's something I thought of, but
I like that.
yeah,
Actually, that's
I
a
like
good
that.
example.
That's also very great for evangelization purposes, but my problem is like the story I'm currently reading is if you were to listen to it as an audiobook, it would be 600 hours. So that's the scale of those stories. So you can imagine I haven't read that many of those stories, just about 4 or so.
600. I don't even.
Yeah. The
That is
Bible
so
is
difficult to
just
imagine.
as a reference. The Bible has 1,500 pages and is 80 hours.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah.
reference.
All right.
That's
So
amazing.
we did have some answers to the question we posed to Muslims: is Allah perfect? And I think they're very interesting
Great.
answers, all three of them. I asked all three of the Muslims in the chat, or that I knew were in the chat. If there are other Muslims, feel free to ask or provide your answers as well. But Yobij, sorry, I have no idea how to pronounce that, says, I would say perfect as in the best of all creation, since we believe he is the creator. So this would be perfect equals best of all things. So something, by this definition, everything, there has to be something that is perfect, which
Yeah,
I thought was an
within the
interesting answer.
grounding is specifically in him being a creator, which is really interesting. Because I would say perfect as in the best of all creation, since we believe he is a creator. So that's an okay definition. I do think it's a little weird to say that it's on account of him being a creator that he is perfect. But I understand where they're coming from. I think I do understand that. So that's fair. That's something.
And then the second answer came from Akron, I guess. He says, he did chose not to answer, but instead attack his fellow Muslim. Do you even know what perfect is? Are you a Hadith rejector? So apparently he didn't like that answer, but failed to provide one of his own. And FP says, don't know. I think that was an answer to the question. I'm not
Yeah,
100% certain, which is, I mean, that's a fair answer.
yeah,
If
that's
you don't
fine.
know, then you don't know.
I'll always accept that answer. I always respect people who can say that. Um, I would like to see what Akron or whatever that person's name was, what hadith they're referring to, because I'm guessing they're thinking that there's a hadith that actually explains that. And so that'd be interesting. That'd be interesting to see if they could cite that hadith for us so we could see how Muslims think about perfection. I would say the one definition somebody gave, that was Yobeji or whoever that was,
Mm-hmm.
about him being the
Best of
best
all
in creation is
Yeah,
a
best creator.
that's a pretty good definition. I definitely think saying though, yeah, that since we believe that's the weird part. Since we believe he is the creator, um, is a little strange because as a Christian, I would say he is perfect beyond creation. And even without creation, he would still be perfect. But I do think I understand what they're saying. They're appealing to the same ish idea where they're saying there's no standard in creation, by which he would be less than, so therefore he's the best of all creation, which means he's perfect. I would say there's just no standard at all because he is the standard. He is the standard. But exactly tell me. Yeah,
Well,
yeah, right.
yeah, to him,
I
right?
agree.
He seemed. I could only interpret that comment as you're wrong, but then he didn't provide any alternative, and I would really like to know what his alternative is.
Same here. And so would this Muslim in the chat also like to know.
I think it makes sense, this definition in a Muslim way, because Allah is greater than Alusa, or how is she called again? This goddess.
Oh, a
Yeah,
lot to
so
lose him and not. That's right. Yeah.
yeah, but it's specifically a lot that is greater because a lot was the high god in the pre-Arabian pantheon. So to say Allah is greater than a lot, Allah is greater than a lot means that he's the high god of the pantheon. Doesn't mean he's the only God. It just means he's the high God of the pantheon.
I wasn't sure anymore if Alat or Alusa, so I took a gamble and guessed wrong.
That's all right. We can't remember all these names floating around, so that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Back to it. 600 hours is crazy. I just want to say that 600 hours for an audiobook. It is wild. That's mind blowing to me.
Yeah, it's
I think
3,500 chapters, and I'm around 1,300 or so currently. But I took a break because I can't spend all my free time reading those books.
I don't think anybody could. I don't know. I don't know if you'd be able to do work, and live life.
My problem is that's probably the thing I can get most addicted to, like reading a good story. So I have to stop at times and then take a break, and then when I start reading again, I have to be careful. Especially those books, they don't end.
So we did get an answer from Akron here. If the attributes of Allah are all part of his utmost beauty and perfection, and Allah is also to be declared far above any shortcomings, this is clear proof from the Quran that Allah is perfect. So I think he's trying to say because the Quran says he's perfect, and that, I mean, whatever he's saying, it's entirely circular. It's not, and it doesn't tell me what the definition of perfect is, unless you're saying that Allah is by definition perfect, in which it's again circular. So, as Yod points out, that's not a hadith. So why was he going on about rejecting?
Oh man, that's what I was just about to say. Okay, never mind. They pointed it out. That's great. I was just about to point that out. I was like, "Where's the hadith part?" I will say this, and when they say Allah is also to be declared far above any shortcomings, that would be okay. That would be okay to say our notion of perfection is simply that whatever lack or fault there is, he does not have in himself. And so that would be okay if they didn't conclude it the way they did. This is clear proof from the Quran that Allah, is perfect. Because then I don't know if they're saying that something being the clear proof from the Quran is perfect, or if they're saying to be declared far above any shortcomings is perfect, or if the attributes of Allah are all part of him is perfect. So,
yeah, that.
But if they just said to be declared above shortcomings, I'd be fine with it. I'd be like, okay, that's fair enough. I can't really think about anything wrong with that kind of definition. In that view. But they just wrote it so funny that I don't.
Yeah, really know I just took out that last comma and thought that there was three thoughts there. That Allah's
right.
attributes is beauty, perfection, whatever. I guess is. I mean, I'm not sure what the point of that part of the statement was, but I at least understood what the words mean. And the second one was that Allah is declared far above shortcomings. And then the third, the two previous things are the proof from the Quran that Allah is perfect. So I think the definition of perfect is to have the utmost beauty. You can't use the imperfection. That's part of the definition. But utmost beauty and being above shortcomings is the definition, and then the proof is that the Quran says so, I think, is what he's trying to say.
Oh, you know what? I think you just laid it out. I think that is what they meant. That being said, I would strongly reject the idea that Allah is utmost beautiful. Just for a lot of reasons. But if to say that he is utmost, that all parts of him are utmost beauty, including his two right hands and his shin, then I don't know if I'd say he's above any shortcoming, because I could say, well, why not, have two left hands or another shin or something. I don't know. I guess, but then again, to give him the benefit of the doubt, I'll say at least one part of this, if said by somebody who knew what they were saying, would be good. And that would be Allah being perfect is that he is declared far above any shortcomings.
I think we shouldn't be too harsh on this because it's very difficult to write short and precise statements. So
True.
if you're trained in that field, then it's possible because you probably thought hundreds of hours on it. But if you're just sometime think about it or just thought of it now because the question was asked, then a conversation would be way better at finding out what the person actually believes than over analyzing a single comment.
Yes,
Yeah, that's true.
and I would definitely, and I already put this invitation in the chat, but I'll do it vocally as well. I would encourage Akron or Yobij or anyone else who wants to have a conversation with me to email me, that is at reasonanswers.com, and we'll set that up. It doesn't have to be a public chat. It could just be a private chat if you don't want to go live, although I think it would be more beneficial because then lots of people would get the benefit out of the conversation. But I'm also open to having a private chat with anyone who wants more information on this, especially you two who have both, well, other than attacking, other than your Akron's behavior towards your beach, that you've demonstrated, politeness and respect, and I would be happy to have a conversation with either one of you. All right, so let's get back to the points that you are making, Ben Rex.
Yes, I think that point, God is perfect, was got a beautiful answer, and I would want to go to the last definition or last definitional question, or depending on how you view it, the second last. But yeah, there is only one God. Is that necessarily true? Because when I have a math equation, then I can have two equally tall maxima. So why is it not possible to have two completely perfect beings? Or
Yes,
three,
this is
or
great.
not just persons, but independent divine essences which are different.
Yes. No, this is Ben's got a great question here. That's excellent. So, in terms of math, right, we're thinking about quantities, and so the notion of perfect quantities, things that are like fully sufficient and separate, we can understand mathematics. But when it comes to qualitative perfection, perfection of qualities instead of quantities, then what it means for there to be a perfect being is for them to not be lacking in any, anything which is proper to them. There's no standard beyond them. The issue that kind of happens when you have, one perfect being who has no standard beyond them is when they have another perfect being. Because if you have another perfect being who has no standard above, next to, or beyond them, and then another perfect being who, again, we're claiming perfection to be, there's no other standard above you because you are that standard. Then if we have two equally perfect things, that means that they both equally have no standard beyond or above them. But by definition, they themselves would both be a standard of some sort of exemplar being or behavior or thought or something. And so when it comes to qualitative perfection, if we mean perfection in the sense that there's no standard beyond, by definition, having two equally perfect beings means now that you have some sort of standard to which the other can be compared and considered less than or needing to grow to fit that standard. If instead we say that perfection means there's no quality that's missing in being the maximal form of itself, let's say that, then we'd have to say, okay, this being is not missing in any quality that makes it maximally perfect, right? That it's uncreated, uncaused, knows all things, and is the source of being itself. If that's what it means to be a perfect being, to be the source of being, then a separate being who is the source of being would either be the source for this one or this one's the source for that one, right? And now when it comes to perfect beings, there has to be some sort of imperfection in one of them. Because if there's not, then one of them is not the source of the other, or there's no comparison, right? But in order for two equally perfect things to exist, the only way we can actually tell if they're different, maybe I can say it like this, maybe this would be the most simple way to say it. In order for two things to actually be different, they would need to be different in some way. In order for two things to be distinct essences, they have to be different in some way. But here, right, we have two equally perfect things. So we have the list of all the things that make something perfect, the list of all the things that make something perfect. And if we have two things that are equally perfect, as in they are whatever those perfect things are, then we can't really say that these two things are separate at all, because they're equally perfect. Whatever it means to be perfect, this thing is that. And this thing also, this separate thing is that. But then if they're both equally perfect in the exact same ways in every instance, then you can't really say that those are two separate, distinct beings, because they're equally perfect in the exact same ways. Every single thing you can possibly say would be correct about this one. And so in that case, you wouldn't be able to have, these two equally perfect beings, because you're talking about the qualitative aspects of something. In math, though, sure, you can have these numbers that are like, equal quantities, right? You can totally have that, but you're not really looking at two separate things in math, right? 2 equals 2. If you're just looking at the concept, then you're just looking at quantities that are being compared, and the quantities themselves are not perfect, so the comparison's a little different. But also, you're not looking at something that has like an intrinsic standard to it for the number 2, besides that it's a quantity like this. So, simply put, for things to be different or for things to differ, they have to have some difference in between them. If two things are equally perfect in every single way of what makes something perfect, then there would be no difference between them. Therefore, you can't have two equally perfect beings, because there would be no difference to distinguish between them.
I would I can see what you say here. I would say it is true that if they are the same in any way, in every way, then I don't know if they have to be the same being or not, but it doesn't really matter, because for one, this assumes that all attributes of God only have one possible solution of being perfect, and that's a claim. I don't grant that claim, but you mentioned in your thinking out loud, you mentioned something which I think is the argument which basically makes the case. Basically, if being the source of beings is part of being perfect, then that necessarily makes just one God. So I think that's the case making point, and the other ones are not. So yeah,
That's good to know. Actually, I'm glad that one worked there. That's good to know.
Would you agree with my reasoning, or is it just are you just happy that I agree with your conclusion?
No. So I would still say that perfection, right? If what we mean by perfection, because the whole sourcing nature of God is pretty important. That He is being itself is pretty important, because then we can't have two equally perfect beings, because to be an absolutely perfect being in the sense of God means to be being your beingness yourself, like you are being. So something else can't exist unless it's dependent upon your being, and so one of these would have to be dependent on the other, which means one of these is not absolutely perfect. So that is a foundational belief about Christian thought in terms of the nature of like perfect being theology. But in terms of the attributes of God. Let's say, you say that there's potentially some other solutions to each attribute of God's nature. The word solution is interesting. The word solution is very interesting because that's a very mathematical concept, right?
Yeah, I'm aware that the polygon is just a story. It's not an argument. It's just to illustrate my point.
Oh no, not even the polygon thing, but just
Yeah.
when you were saying, the thing you don't grant about.
Solution is also just because I like the math. So
yeah, no, that makes sense.
That's why I used that word. There's probably a better philosophical word.
Yeah, no, I get it. Like explanation, like an explanation of an attribute or the best form of it, right? And so I would say that by definition, since the whole notion of perfection is that there's no standard above or beyond the standard of God, since he is his own standard, then to say that there's other, to use your word, solutions, right? Explanations, ways of seeing it. We could say that other ways of seeing an attribute of God would kind of require that there's some standard beyond God, which then goes against the whole perfection idea. If we assume it to be God being a perfect being means he has no standard above or beyond himself. So what is this person saying? That's why God has 99 names, which is what.
Yeah. So I asked him why. He said that. What he means by that's why. So something is why Allah has 99 names, but I don't know what. But I assume it was something you just said, like something that has been said recently. But I don't know which thing he thinks is related to the 99 names. So I asked him.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about what I just said to kind of think how this comment would be related.
It could also be referring to another comment, so it's
that's true. That's true. There might have been a conversation in the comments. That's true.
Well, yeah, he hadn't said anything in a while, and no one had said anything to him in a while. So I think it was about what you were saying. But anyway, I asked.
I'll have to watch back later and see what he might have been referring to. Maybe he was referring to the nature of the list of all the things that make a perfect being. And so he's thinking that that's why God has 99 names, so it's like the whole checklist thing I was talking about. So maybe they're referring to that. That could be something. Yeah. So I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt.
Quick question from Houston here, which I can answer. Does the Quran Hadith actually list the 99 attributes, or are they just dreamt up by scholars? So no, there is no Sahih narration or the Quran that gives you the 99 attributes. There is a Hadith that does, but it's da'if and is mostly rejected by Muslim scholars. So there are Sahih narrations, and I think the Quran as well says that he has 99 attributes or 99 names, but none of them actually list what they are. So any name list you see is something that a human being came up with to try to figure out what those 99 names are.
And many of them are just repeats of each other over and over and over and over and over. You'll see he's most merciful to the Muslim, and then next one, he's most merciful to the animal, and a lot of these ones are just kind of repeats of other ones, at least from the list I've seen online.
Yeah, so if you look at two different lists, you'll probably see slightly different. I mean, they'll be mostly the same, of course, because there's only so many things you can come up with, but they'll be slightly different because none of these are, considered authoritative or authentic in Islam. All right, so hopefully we get some clarification on what Akron meant by that's why Allah has 99 names, but if not, we'll just move along. Here, actually, let me take a super chat to give him a chance to come up with something.
And Allah will bless you in a million ways. You find the tree will grow and you will have lots and lots of wealth. This is the example that we gave to the children. And I'm letting you know that when you sow that seed by giving, you shall receive much more than you gave by the will of Allah. Give as much as you can, for indeed you will reap much more than you have sown.
So this one is related to the apples. Didn't say the word apples, but this is him continuing on. This is the example we gave to the kids, he says, which the example was you ate the apple and you still had the seeds, and then you planted the seeds. But I think it's especially gross that he's like, yeah, we're telling all the kids that they need to be giving money to our organization. And yeah. Anyway, the super chat from the scripture plug Albert. First time catching the stream live, and it's been awesome. Prayers going up for your ministry, Thaddeus, and God bless you all. Thank you very much for that, Albert. We had a chance, him and I had a chance to talk on the Black Doctor's channel about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, and I look forward to working with him again soon. So check out his channel if you're not familiar with that. All right, let's see. Was there any new response by Akron? No. So let's just move along then.
Yeah. To finish up this question, I just want to ask a question again to see if what your response is.
Who ate the apple?
So you said that, there is you said that for two gods to be perfect, they have to differ in some attribute, and it is not. We can't really know for sure what all the attributes of God are, because in some way he is unknowable. We can set certain guidelines or certain limits. We can get some guesses based on what scripture tells us and what logic tells us, but we can't actually know all the attributes. So I think for example, eternal, there is only one way for it to be perfect, but I assume there is at least one which may have two possible solutions. And so if you were to go that route, it's very difficult to prove that there is only one God. Do you agree with that observation?
Well, so I don't necessarily. Just because the number of attributes, I'll say it like this, the number of attributes of God doesn't actually play into the question of being able to differentiate between two perfect beings, two equally perfect beings. Because even if there was just one attribute of God that made him perfect, then in order for there to be two absolutely perfect beings who are divine, they would need to in some way differ beyond that attribute, but that attribute's the thing that makes them perfect, right? So the number of attributes, because I agree with you, the number of attributes of God are unknowable, but it's not the number of attributes, but the attributes themselves, like just the fact of the attributes. Yeah, whatever that number is.
I mean,
oh, go ahead.
If there were just the attribute eternal, then I agree there can only be one God, because eternal only has one solution. Yeah. But we know that there are more than one attribute, and so just one of them has to be different for there to be two different, or for there to be a possibility of two different eternal gods.
Yes, but they'd also have to be equally perfect. And that's kind of the difficulty, right? Because then if we're saying that they're equally perfect things, then we'd have to explain how this other thing would be equally perfect, which again is a little strange, just conceptually understand. Because then we'd have to say, oh, well, this thing is perfect in its attributes, even though it's different from, God, who is perfect in his attributes. We'd have to say either that there's a standard beyond both of them, which is a separate argument, right? If we say that these two equally perfect beings exist separately, then there must be some standard beyond them that they're being compared to know how they're different. And so I think the exact number of attributes doesn't really matter, because even if it was just one, in order for them to be two equally perfect things, and there's only one possible attribute, then that one would still show that you can't have more than one God. And so any other attributes you add to it still have to go back to, the fact that there has to be a standard beyond. And if there's a standard beyond, then you either have to say that neither of them is perfect because there's some standard beyond them, or you'd have to say that one of them is perfect and the other one is just less than, because it's not fitting that standard. And so I think the idea of two equally perfect eternal beings doesn't really have a logical solution.
I would say a horse can be perfect for racing, another horse could be perfect for carrying a carriage, and they are both horses which are perfect but not in the same way. How would you respond to that?
Actually, I figured you would say that, which is why I said two equally eternal beings, like two equally fundamental beings that are necessary, right? So that's what I meant by eternal. Really, I meant necessary beings. So two equally perfect beings would be beings that are not dependent on anything else. Horses would be categorically different because they're.
Yeah, I'm aware it was an image. It was not a. It was a story.
No, I know. I know it's just a story, but believe it or not, it's actually philosophically important. The difference between a horse and God, right? And so this isn't me saying that your example was wrong. I'm actually saying that your example helps us to know something unique about the comparison between God and creation. For the horses, they're contingent. They're dependent on some other reality for them to exist. For God is independent of all other realities because he just is being itself. And so when we're comparing, two equally perfect beings in the divine sense, we're saying that there's this being who is necessary, who is independent of all other reality, because they are reality. There's nothing else. And so since they're independent of all reality, and that they're the source of all being and all reality, then we'd have to say that, there could not be another being, just by the nature of that perfect being independent, being necessary, and not contingent. And so I think that's another way to approach this. There cannot be two necessary perfect beings, two equally necessary perfect beings. Because for something to be necessary and not contingent, it means that it's independent from everything else around it. It just simply exists as it is without any other reality existing. No other reality exists that it's bound to. If there's two equally perfect beings, then they wouldn't both be necessary, because they're equally perfect beings, right? And so there's either some sort of relationship between them that explains how both exist, but then that means that they're getting their existence from somewhere. They're getting their existence from something else, which means neither of them would be perfect. Or at least one is and the other one's dependent. The other one's contingent on the necessary being.
So Jack Ray asked a related question here. Could a created being be perfected even for a task when it be more tuned for that task?
Yeah, I would say that a created being could be perfect for a task. But there's a very big difference between something that is perfect per se, which means essentially, so just as it is, not even what it does, but as it is. There's a big difference between something being perfect in its essence versus something being perfect in a specific field, right? And so a perfect being and something that is able to do perfectly what it needs to do are very different things. This would be an equivocation because it's equivocating on what we mean by perfect, right? When we talk about perfect for God, because we want to avoid the equivocation fallacy, when we talk about being perfect in the case of God, we're talking about his essence, his nature, just how he is. When we're talking about what makes this horse perfect for this task, we're saying that it's able to carry out a function. A president who is acting perfectly would be one who is able to lead all of the nation together in unity towards a certain end, or A judge who's perfect is a judge who's able to decide in every single case who went against the law and what the correct judgment and punishment would be there. And so this is something we would want to avoid, just using the word without thinking about the differences and what we mean by it. A perfect being, when we're talking about the divine, we're talking about essence. When we're talking about all these other things, we're talking about perfection in just the action that's happening, the thing that it's able to do for a specific task. And we wouldn't apply that to God because there's no standard outside of God to say how he, should do something, right? For a horse, we can say how a horse should perfectly do something because the horse should carry the, whatever it is, the manure or the barrels or something, or a perfect racehorse, should race and get first place every time. So there's some sort of standard that we're comparing it to for that perfection. The perfection of God, he is his own standard. That's the difference.
Yeah,
Very good.
By the
Thank you for that.
way, I understood your point about which you wanted to say, so I can agree with it.
Right on, right on. And also for the people in the audience, I hope that difference in perfection as it's used makes sense. So please let me know if it does or does not. Later on, I could address that.
Absolutely. So I think now might actually be a good time for this question that was raised earlier by Akron. He said, if Jesus and God are basically the same, then why did Jesus speak cryptically when saying he is God instead of flat out saying, I'm God, especially since the people saw a man being God as blasphemy? Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for acknowledging that people accused Jesus of blasphemy, that in fact, that is why they wanted him put to death, because usually a Muslim will tell me that Jesus never claimed to be God. But in fact, people did see that as blasphemy and accused him thereof. As for the substantive comment here, why didn't he say, I'm God? Well, one, that isn't a very meaningful statement in the multicultural, polytheistic environment that he is operating. Second of all, anyone can say words, right? So that's why he didn't say, I'm God. Now, why didn't he say, I'm Yahweh, the specific deity that, the true deity, the true God that he is? Well, anyone can say those words. Instead, he does what only God could actually do, and that's demonstrate that he has the attributes of God. He makes numerous claims about having attributes that are uniquely given to Yahweh in the Bible. And then he demonstrates that he actually has those attributes by working miracles. A good example of this is when he says to a paralyzed man, be joyous, your sins are forgiven. And then people are kind of grumbling. Anyone could say your sins are forgiven. What kind of joke is this? We wanted him to be healed. So then Jesus heals him, makes him walk, and says, which is easier, to forgive sins or to make a paralyzed man walk? But so that you may know I have the ability to forgive sins, I will demonstrate that I can heal him as well. So he proves himself to be God rather than just going around making a claim that would have no real meaning, because anyone can make that claim. A crazy person does make that claim, right? Mentally ill people make that kind of claim all the time. Looks like maybe David wants me to bring up a slide to add something to that, so I'll do so.
Yeah, just one or two slides I have here that could be a little helpful. Right here, let me see if I could actually zoom in real quick to show people. Are you actually seeing the PowerPoint as it is?
Yep.
Perfect. So where does the scripture say that the Son is God? So what's really important to understand, and I appreciate this person actually saying, well, Jesus says it, but he says it cryptically. Why does he say it so cryptically? Well, in some cases, I would say that he doesn't say it cryptically, as cryptically as people might think. Right, like when Jesus says, "And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began." The glory of God, according to Isaiah 42, verse 8, says, "I am Yahweh, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, neither my praise unto graven images." And so, by the sounds of it, Jesus is claiming things that only Yahweh can claim, just as Thaddeus was saying. And he's doing things that only Yahweh can do. Forgiving sins is one example. He says in John chapter 5 and elsewhere, I think John chapter 10, that he can actually give people life, raise the dead. He says that the Father can give life, and so can he. John chapter 5, he even says that people should give him the same honor, John chapter 5, verse 17 to 23, that he has the same honor as the Father. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he's not only was breaking the Sabbath, but also was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Therefore, Jesus answered and was saying to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in the same way." Which is wild to say that Jesus is saying he does things just as the Father does them. Wild. And also, look at this. Jesus doesn't even have to say, "I am God, worship me," for the people to know what he's saying. It says, "For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but also was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." The Jews, the Pharisees at the time, did not even need Jesus to say, "I am God, worship me," for them to know what he was saying. So to them, he was not being very cryptic at all. They actually knew exactly what he was claiming. And then I go on, "For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself is doing. And the Father will show him greater works than these, so that you will be amazed. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so the Son also gives life to whom he wishes. For not even the Father judges anyone, but he has given all judgment to the Son, so that all will honor the Son just as they honor the Father. The one who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him." So that's all I really needed to show there. I'll stop sharing here. But I just wanted to say that it seemed quite clear to his Jewish audience what he was saying. It seemed quite clear to the Pharisees what he was saying. They didn't think he was being cryptic when he says, "I and the Father are one." They didn't think he was being cryptic when he said in John 8:58, "Before Abraham was, Yahweh, I am," where they picked up stones to stone him, right? They even say later on in John chapter 10, "You, a man, claim to be God," right? So it seemed not very cryptic to them at the time. It might seem cryptic to some modern day, but
Yeah, that's a very good point. That the text, well, for one, Jesus is speaking obviously to a first century audience who has a particular cultural understanding and a particular way of knowing things. Perhaps it would have been more unclear if he just said, "I am God" all the time. Maybe that would be less clear. In Scripture, the concept of God, the concept of Elohim in the Hebrew, isn't exactly identical to the modern conception of God. Lesser beings can be called Elohim. So to claim to be what we would call God, to be the one true God, the creator of the universe, and so on and so forth, is actually more involved than just saying, "I am God." So he does things for a specific audience, and thus you shouldn't be reading things with a 21st century lens and saying, "This makes no sense to me." Well, it wasn't spoken to you. It wasn't made for you specifically. It was ultimately made for you because it's made for all people, but it wasn't made specifically for you. It wasn't written so that it made no sense for 2 millennia and then suddenly makes perfect sense in the 21st century. A couple comments from the audience and some follow-up from Akron. John A. says, "God shares his glory with no one, yet Jesus shares his glory with the Father. Therefore, Jesus is God." Absolutely. Houston says, "Early on,
Who ate the
Jesus
apple?
wanted to be somewhat cryptic so that his ministry would last the whole 3 years, and that is very good, and it's the explanation I go with for what's called the secret, that Jesus seems to be asking people to keep this a secret as he's going along. Trinity points out everyone can go around telling others they are gods or prophets, and indeed, Muhammad did that. He went around claiming he was a prophet, but that doesn't demonstrate he actually is one. So the follow-up from Akron here, but because he didn't say it now, instead of having we should follow Jesus or reject him, now we have, was Jesus even God in the first place? Well, that would be the question regardless of what he said, right? Just because if he said, I am God, that would in no way answer the question of whether he was God or not. So we'd still be asking that question. So I don't consider that a substantive point at all. But his second follow-up is a little better. And what about people who followed the Old Testament because it said not to worship anyone other than God? What would they think if someone preached that they were God? How would they feel? I think if you were paying attention, we kind of already answered this. They picked up stones to kill Jesus because they didn't believe that he was God. They understood, right? They understood his claim, and the reaction was, how dare you? However, that was only some people's reaction. Other people, because they already understood that God was complex, that he had a multi-personal nature. They understood that the promised Messiah, the Son of Man, would be a divine figure because no human being could fulfill the prophecies set out for the Messiah. They were like, actually, this does make sense. And thus, you ended up having two groups: Jews who rejected Jesus because of their understanding of the scripture, and Jews who accepted Jesus because of their understanding of the scripture. Your question perhaps boils down to, couldn't he have convinced everyone that he was God? And I would say, well, maybe he could have, right? Maybe God could force everyone to believe, but that's not what the true God desires. He desires a relationship. He desires a family. He doesn't desire people who are forced to believe he exists, or in this case, that Jesus is God. He wants people who have a relationship with him. And for that purpose, I think he did it in the best way possible. Anything you want to add, David or Benrix?
No.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And remember what Jesus said, if they had followed the prophets, then they would accept me, right? So Jesus tells the Pharisees and many of the Jewish people at the time, if you knew the prophets and if you follow the prophets, you would not reject me, right? And so that's an important thing to consider.
Indeed. Marion says, I think the statement, I am God, would be less impressive than giving sight to the blind, making the lame walk, cleansing the lepers, and raising the dead. I would have to agree. And Breakfast Gun makes an excellent point here. Seems like Muslims want Jesus to explain himself the way Muhammad, aka Allah, explains himself in the Quran. Muhammad, you really are a prophet. You can find yourself in the previous scriptures. All those people who are saying you're not a prophet, they're just disbelievers. Don't worry about them. That's what Muslims seem to want, which to me, as an outsider, seems exactly like what a false prophet would do. Go around constantly saying, anyone who doesn't believe in me, they are rejected. Allah made them not believe in me. If you actually read the Bible, you would believe in me. Well, I have read the Bible and you're not in there. You liar! Get out of here! I will kill you!
Ain't that true? That's wild. Yeah, that's true. That is a constant thing. It's the last thing I'll say on it, but that's a pretty constant thing, is the importing of Muslim standards onto Jesus and then being confused why Jesus doesn't fit the Muslim standard of, what they're expecting, right? Well, that's because you're importing a Muslim standard based off of Muhammad on someone who is not really in any real sense comparable to Muhammad. And, you're for some reason forcing your standards onto someone completely different.
All right. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get back to the original topic here. These questions are good. I'm very glad. I want to repeat this. I'm very glad for the Muslims who've been here. The interaction has been great, much better than typical. So I'm very happy that you're both here, and I welcome you back anytime. All right. So I think you had at least one more point you wanted to make, Ben Rex?
No, at most one more point.
At
Because
most. Okay.
God is loving. That's also something which I would question, but that's the entire next chapter, so I won't go into that here. So that's why I said at most one more point. Now, from perfect love to Trinity, this is the simplified version will be attached at the end, and only very shortly talk about. So here, I know that font size, and I didn't manage to get the presentation from the link, and so I just snipping tool from the screen. So it might not be the best quality, but yeah. So I will just go through the points. So God is morally and metaphysically perfect. Here I just put the agree. Then thus he exemplifies the objective standard of the perfection of moral good in his nature, which Christians and Muslims affirm are given arguments from objective morality. I think this is just premise one again, just a bit specified. So I would put that as some form of redundancy. Or would you agree that this is redundancy?
The reason, that's a good question. The reason I had to make a separate premise is because in the question of morally and metaphysically perfect is, since a lot of people don't know what perfection would be, I have to say, thus, given what perfection is, he exemplifies the objective standard of those perfections, right? And so I felt the need to make a separate premise so that I can draw on how that general deductive claim, that God is morally and metaphysically perfect, how that particularly can be applied. Because premise one is helpful, but premise two is the thing that you'll actually see continuing throughout the rest of this argument. Premise one actually has far less presence in this whole argument than premise two does. Because then I'll keep on referring to him as the objective standard, the perfection, the perfect standard for each thing. So I wouldn't say it's redundant in that it adds nuance to what perfection means. Although you're correct that I probably could have just fused that one into premise one, made it just one really long premise. So that's fair. I probably could have just fused premise two into premise one.
I have no clue on how philosophy books and stuff does it, or papers. So is it usually, or the way I think would be preferable would be to have basically a text first explaining the context of all these premises and then keeping the argument short. Is that how it is usually done?
Yeah. I guess it depends on who you are, because there's some people like Swinburne. Swinburne would have had arguments that were 39 parts or something. That were just do, and then he refers back to this one, brings it down. He's 39 different steps. And then there's ones that are smaller. Mine is a little bit longer than the average one, but compared to what most philosophers have, and especially most atheist philosophers, where they have 17 different premises for some of them. This one was slightly smaller than some philosophers have it. But yeah, I think it's better to have a smaller argument. So I would agree with you there. I agree that it's better, but there's no hard and fast rule as to how long each of the premises are. And if anything, the text that would have been accompanied with this, because I agree, having a text beforehand is helpful. The text that would have accompanied this would have been my verbal contribution during the presentation. That way I can kind of explain the general ideas before I went through all this.
Yeah. Yeah, the background is for me, of course. I prefer to have, if I have a equation, I prefer to have all variables to be independent if possible. And so if two variables do the same thing, it's a bit it makes everything more convoluted. So that's why I prefer the having as little redundancy as possible in it, with the consequence that you can just put everything on a slide. So I can understand that if you want to present it in a presentation which is somewhat self-explanatory, then you would divert from that. Do you agree with that observation? Good.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Of course, this is not exactly math because we're talking about qualities rather than quantities. And so it's always important on your end just to make sure that we don't equivocate by taking what we use in quantities like mathematics and applying it to qualities like moral perfection or metaphysical perfection. So that's the one thing I'd caution you on is to equate quantitative math to qualitative philosophy.
Yeah, within math you also have quality and quantity. Like I think analysis is without numbers, and so yeah.
True.
So, but I can see your point that although some of it is transferable, not always. And as an outsider in this field, I have to be aware to not step into that that problem, that false thinking. Then God is immutable, eternal, or unchanging. I agree with that. Then premise 4 is does whatever he essentially at the level of his essence is, he is eternally and immutably. This is also a combination of premise 3 and something else. But yeah, it's every premise which has a thus and therefore in it has a sign of redundancy in it, in my opinion. Is that a good observation?
I think I'd have to ask you what you mean by redundancy, because what's happening here is I'm making sure that people continue. There's actually a premise that was in a slide before this where I talked about how whatever God is, he not only is, but he is in a combinatorial, in a united way. And so that's why I keep on having certain premises that are combining these, because the whole point of the premises, like conclusions in an argument, is that they combine the ideas from the prior premises. For these longer arguments, my premises have to continuously combine all the ideas to keep it consistent, to make sure people are following through. So redundancy would not exactly apply because there is something technically new being said.
Okay.
Right? In premise 5, for instance, premise 5 is now combining all the things written before, right? So premise 5 says, therefore, whatever moral perfections, that's a reference back to premise 2, God exemplifies, he does so eternally, combining premise 4, premise 3, and immutably is what we're going at there. And so that'd be combining premise 2, premise 3, and premise 4 all into one. And so it might have been better if instead of saying premise 5, I said like conclusion 1. That might have been a little bit better now that I think about it. So people can see like this is the first conclusion from this first set of data. And then I could have been like premise 6, premise 7, conclusion 2. So I probably could have, instead of having like more and more premises there, I could have just said after premise 4, here's conclusion 1. That way it didn't seem redundant, but I don't think it's necessarily redundant since we're thinking of all of these as like being cumulative, additive each time. But I guess it depends on how you define redundancy.
Yeah, I can see two good ways. Either like in between conclusion, doing it that way, and that's the way you formulated it. Or you could also say, since you said there is actually some new information, then you, instead of therefore this and this, you could say as a premise, this and this can be combined, and this is the new information. So that would be a non-redundant premise.
Yes.
And, yeah,
That's fair. That's actually, you know what, that is fair. I would agree with that. Because I do this in some way in a different paper, where you could say, given P2, P3, and P4, we can know this. So that would be actually a way to say it. I could say for premise 5, I can say, given P2, P3, and P4, we know this. So that would be, yeah, that'd be good. I like that. I think that's actually a valuable note to take in terms of simplifying that. Where's my pen? Yeah. I actually like that quite a bit. And I think that I've used that in some of my research and my essays. So doing the if P3, P4, and P5, then here's what we know. So that's good. I accept that. I like that. That's actually a pretty smart idea.
yeah, it's just like you mixed here the premise conclusion, and that's what made me think that it's redundant. But yeah, I can see that this is a separate new information. So yeah, good. Yeah, point 5, I agree, because it's a combination of the previous 4 points, and I agreed with those. So premise 6 is love is an objective moral good. I disagree with that, but I will go into this in a further slide. Then premise 7, therefore God exemplifies the perfect standard of love eternally and unchangeably. And yeah, basically this is a combination again of previous things, so that's fine with me. Premise 9, therefore God is eternally and unchangeably exemplifying the perfection of love. God is eternally and unchangeably willing the good of another person, willing unity with good of another. And here, this is basically giving a definition of love, and it requires the previous premises. And I also will talk about this in later slides. Then premise 10, if God is eternally only one person, then we must assume either A, that perfect love is exemplified when one person wills their own good without regard for another, so, or in other words, selfish love. And premise 10b, the perfect love is exemplified by willing the good of or unity with the good of another person. However, love is then not fundamental to God's attributes, which means he is mutable. Love became a fundamental attribute, or that he is imperfect. He lacks a moral perfection, or he lacks an object for his love. And with both of these, I will talk about in later slides as well. Then premise 10. Yeah, basically we'll go into all of the things in later slides. But yeah, just to finish it up, premise 11 is, if premise 10a, then God's love is purely selfish, and so our highest form of love should be purely selfish in order to replicate his love. Then premise 12, however, the highest form of love is not purely selfish. Furthermore, such a love would prevent God from making anything at all. And then premise 13, if premise 10b, then God is not metaphysically perfect, mutable, incomplete, both. In that case, then he is not God. And now to the conclusion of everything. Therefore, if God is morally and metaphysically perfect, such that his attribute is love, then he must eternally be more than one person. And yeah, I think I already hinted that I don't agree with all the premises, so I also don't agree with the conclusion. But I think in itself, if given all the premises, then the conclusion makes sense.
Okay, so that makes sense. So you're saying the logic is valid if the premises were true, but it seems like the major sticking point would be premise 6. Love is an objective.
No, that's one of the major.
Well,
sticking
because
points.
everything else is technically dependent on that, right? It seems like almost everything else you have here says, that it's referring back to that.
No, there is also another point, namely the definition of love itself. What this definition is and that it is objective. Those are the two sticking points.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Oh, sorry.
No. Actually, go on with this one because it looks like those slides are gonna deal with it. So this will be good.
Okay. Here I try to do it as well in a philosophical argument style. I think I didn't succeed perfectly, but yeah. Premise 1: objective moral laws require a moral lawgiver. Premise 2: the world is created according to the morals which the creator set into its foundation. The conclusion, I know it's not really the conclusion of the premise, but the point which I wanted to say is we know that love is an objective moral good because God is love. Therefore, we cannot use the objectiveness of love to prove that God is love. So I think that this entire thing is circle reasoning, because we say love is an objective moral good, and because of God, we can't just switch it around. And I'm sure there is a philosophical word for that, but would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, so if I'm going through this, objective moral laws require a moral lawgiver. There is a little bit of hopping around on this. That's a little
Yeah,
slow.
I know.
Which is fine. It's fine because I think I know what your premises in between these would be. So objective moral laws require an objective moral lawgiver would then imply, because we could structure it like this. If there are objective moral laws, then there's an objective moral lawgiver. Premise 1. Premise 2 would be there are objective moral laws. Premise 3, conclusion. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver, and this moral lawgiver we call God. So that'd be the first argument behind premise 1. Mm-hmm. Which, of course, if you're asking, how can we prove that there's objective moral laws? That's not to ask how can we prove that there's objective moral laws. We'd have to say through intuition and inductive reasoning, that all people, even beyond their own cultures, have this understanding of the nature of goodness as something that should be, right? So through inductive reasoning, we could actually show that the prospect of there being objective moral laws that go beyond our standards and beyond naturalistic law is not sufficient, right? So we could see that there's this implied intuitive sense of objective moral law. But again, in a qualitative and philosophical sense, we're looking for proving through logical development and not through some other observable quality, right? And so after the first argument that goes into premise 1, then we would go to the world's created according to the morals which the
this might not be that relevant now that I think about it.
Yeah, exactly. You see, you figured it out before I even said it. So premise 2 was not as relevant to what's happening on that one. Mm-hmm. Because really we're talking about moral laws being intuitively understood, and therefore with this intuition we have to explain where this intuition comes from. Because if we simply say, well, it's intuition, therefore we can't really know where it comes from, well, we still have to ask, okay, but where does intuition come from? And the best explanation for an intuition that's shared across time and culture would be something that is beyond time and culture. And this thing which is beyond time and culture, we would call God. And so...
Or genes. It could also be in the genes.
In theory, the issue with pure genetic understanding of intuition is that you would think significant differences in the way that people define good foundationally between cultures. But there is some sense in which goodness as a basic principle, not in the exact ways you see it lived out, but in a basic principle of goodness is that which is desirable, and evil is that which is not desirable, or is not the thing you should pursue, then we would see that that's maintained between and across cultures, even across oceans. And so you would expect greater variation in that at the foundation if it was just genetic. But it seems like there's something more to it than that, even from like a purely naturalistic metaphysical approach, like Dr. Michael Reeves or Paul Draper or something.
I have to disagree with this statement. I think generally evolution and genes is used way too much to say, yeah, it could explain this, it could explain that. There is way too much storytelling, especially in
Yes.
evolutionary psychology.
Yeah.
But this specific point, I don't really have a problem with saying this moral intuition is encoded into the gene to a certain level, and through observation we can find out how deep it is and how specific it is encoded into the gene. So here I have to say
I would strongly disagree with you on this point. If so you could say that God encodes morals into genes. You could say that God encodes moral intuitions into genes. You could. But
Yes.
the issue is that what we consider morality is not just the baseline assumptions, but also like the way that's lived out, right? So evolution by itself is not sufficient in explaining the nature and strength of moral intuitions. Take, for instance, the moral intuitions about disabled people. Disabled people, by all accounts, evolutionarily and genetically speaking, according to Hamilton's rule and Hamilton's law about genetic behavioral development, according to that really good law on how behavior should develop in an evolutionary system, you should have good behaviors that are called good, develop that have a really high positive impact on the genetics of that individual who's helped out or of the community, their genetics. In the case of people who are born with a severe disability, all of our morals should point to us abandoning that person. We would say the most good thing you could do, evolutionarily speaking, is to abandon that person at birth so as to not drain the resources of the population, since that person likely won't have the sufficient fitness to achieve physical and sexual fitness for their own children to be born. And so, and that's just one example. Obviously, then we go to racism, right? And we would say tribalism, which is the original form of racism, makes sense in an evolutionary system. And it should be considered a factual moral good because it does increase the genetic benefit of your culture, the people that are closest to you, according to Hamilton's rule. R times B is greater than C. And so we should have all our intuitions saying that tribalism, which is manifested in racism, is a moral good, and it's good for our survival, and it's good. But humans don't, right? We have these things that are purely anti-genetic. There's even crazy things people support modern day that I disagree with. But those crazy things that are anti-evolutionary, anti-sexual fitness, that can destroy a kid's ability to reproduce or whatever, societies are starting to call that good, which would go against evolution, in which in evolutionary cases you just support whatever increases sexual fitness and reproductive fitness the most. So I would say, from my background in in evolutionary biology, there's things evolution can explain. I would agree with you on that first point. But when it comes to the nature and depth and exact examples of the weird morals that humans have into and between cultures, it's a poor system. Ethnography, the study of behavior, development of behaviors in like evolution, it's just not a good grounding, not a good system. So I would strongly contend on that point.
Yeah, and I think you, as you take one strict evolutionary concept, like the most simple version of it, and then base expectation on what we should observe based on that strict version, and then say therefore evolution can't explain it. But I'm not. I don't think
Not
evolution.
can't, but does a very poor job.
Yeah, but I think it is possible. I mean, if you have a neural network, they are sometimes compared, and then you can teach it one thing, and then it goes. Then when you apply it to a slightly different situation, then it can go into completely wild direction. And I know it's a bad analogy, but I think similar things could happen with evolution. For example, a fish in a cave loses its eye because in this environment it's more efficient to lose the eye. Or if you have a community, then over time it makes more sense to support the community than yourself, because a chance of your genes being spread increases more if the community survives than if just you survive. So there are mechanisms which, in my opinion, are enough to grant to make basically to explain that. So why there are certain morals which are across all humans, and and also there is a certain bias we should be very careful on avoiding. Christianity managed to spread all over the world, basically, and it even influenced Hinduism and Buddhism and certain African religions and everything. It managed to influence a lot of things. So if we say, yeah, there are moral goods which are shared worldwide, we have to be very careful to not observe basically the Christian values which came to this region later. So,
of course. Yeah, that's why I was very careful when I said those basic moral principles. Notice how that's why I'm very careful with my language when it comes to this stuff. When I said shared values, I said basic moral values, very basic things, not the specific manifestations, but basic moral values. And so that's why I didn't implicitly import Christian specific ones, but just this general sense. And then again, with my explanation about evolutionary development of behavior, that's why I said that within communities, you have tribalism where you have behaviors that support your community, your genetically relevant and related community. But what you just said, and I agree with, the issue is that's not against what I was saying. What I was saying is that you should, just like you see with many animal groups and even with many chimps modern day, you should have, by all major accounts, the most probable, the most by a vast majority, and I really, this is clear from evolutionary science and ethnography and the study of ethology and the development of behavior, the much higher probability that you should see, given the principles of evolution towards beneficial sexual reproduction, is, yes, the benefit of your community, of your genetically related community, but not of some other community that's not as closely genetically related to yours. So I agree. Evolution, again, like I said before, can explain small communal moral behaviors, but not intercommunal moral behaviors in between people who otherwise could be considered dangerous and taking away from the resources for those most closely genetically related to you. So that's why I was very careful to say that.
I would say Christianity is very unique in that, or most societies are racist and tribal, and certain atheists called Christianity a mind virus. So I would say I don't see how this point you raised is really helping your case, I think it's actually it's either neutral or in my favor.
Yeah. Can you explain how it's in the neutral or in your favor?
Basically, I would say there is certain basic moral laws are encoded in the genes, but not all of them. So there is specifics and there is some variety to it, and the specifics are just very basic moral laws, and then if the further there is a genetic and cultural difference, the more things can be overwritten. So if we look at tribalism, the specific point tribalism, then generally we see what we would expect from evolution, but there is the possibility of deviating from that because there is always a balance between genes and culture. And so in our case, in the case of tribalism, it is overwritten by culture at times.
Yeah,
So,
which I understand that. I think under a Christian system, because that's the difficulty, right? The whole idea of there being a difference between culture and genes is only possible if you have some sort of like immaterial reality, like a soul, in which people have free will decisions, and so despite their genetics, they can make choices. But the whole notion of there being a difference between culture and genes in a purely atheistic evolutionary system doesn't make any sense.
it does. Dolphins have different dialects in their
What
speaking.
was that?
So dolphins, they can speak with each other and they have different dialects. So there is
That would be
certain
genetic
things.
differences, right?
They don't build on genetic difference, but they have a genetically enabled language, and the way it plays out varies between schools, or even singing birds like the robin or whatever. They have dialects and they can and stuff like this. So I think that there is. Of course, we could go all the way to say evolution is not logically consistent with free will and rationality, but then we would enter an entirely different stage. I just want to limit ourselves to this stage in this point.
That's
Unless-
fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
It would get more complex after that. Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying I've studied the songbird stuff and even the variations in clicking and sounds, not languages, but sounds that you have for communication between animals. And usually that's broken down to just slight variations in genetics that are expressed in different environments. And so there's still some sort of like genetic foundation no matter what, and slight variations in water temperature or the open expanse of the ocean, how open that expanse is, the temperature of the water, or even for birds, the temperature of the weather, how easily sound will carry in that changes as well. And so I'd say that conversation does get significantly more complex, since even many atheistic philosophers of science would say that all things collapse to genes and genetics, and culture is just a manifestation of your genetics. But that does get us probably away from the main topic at hand.
So I did have a comment from the audience, which is directly related to what you were just discussing. Justin says, I have heard an atheist philosopher say love is our involuntary reaction to the virtue of others. I don't agree with this assessment, but it's the best description of love I've heard without referencing God.
Almost. Except for the claim that it's the virtue of others, to which you'd have to explain, okay, what do you even mean by involuntary? Because I think people can choose to love, or at least if you take the whole dogtastic believism approach, right, where you could say that you could choose to love, then I don't know. That's interesting. I'd have to see what atheist philosopher says that. Love is our involuntary reaction to the virtue. Because then you're saying that there's this thing exists.
Yeah, right. There's an implication that virtue is a real thing here, right? Which then you have to justify it. So you've just pushed it from love to virtue. You haven't really explained.
Yeah, it's kind of just kick the can down the road.
He also said, I don't think there are basic moral values shared around the world. Lots of wholesale butchery has gone on all over. I don't think the Aztecs had knowledge of God's morals.
Well, that's
I
an
would
equivocation.
suggest, yeah, well, I would suggest that there certainly is at minimum a shared principle of morality. If there is no such thing as morality, even ignoring that, I don't think that morals are necessarily different in every culture, but even ignoring that, you still have to explain why everyone thinks there are morals. Everyone has a set of beliefs that they think are correct, very passionately think they are correct. It's very important to them. It's not just like a casual observation, like, oh, the sky is blue. We all agree the sky is blue. It's something that is very, very important to the nature of who a human being is, it seems. And I think that requires an explanation.
Yeah. And even when I say basic moral values, I mean even the most foundational, basic ontological one, which is the moral value that goodness is that which should be pursued and evil is that which should not be pursued, right? So at the most basic foundational level, there's this understanding of the attraction that there ought to be towards goodness. And yet, even then, the desire that some people have for the things they know to be wrong, right? Which adds a really intriguing aspect to what humans are, in that they have that as a quality, as a possibility. And to say I don't think Aztecs had knowledge of God's morals is very confusing because that's, again, not relevant to the discussion. Aztecs believed when they were offering up people as human sacrifices that they were appeasing the gods. They believed that to sacrifice one was better than for an entire nation, an entire people to die. So they still believed they were doing a good. You could say that that was not actually good, and I would agree. But to say they had no knowledge of morals or of any morals of any god would be incorrect because they were led by their very belief about the morality of some sort of substitutionary atonement by some child in their place each day. And so, or at least whenever they would do their sacrifices. So I think there's a... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then I had a couple funny comments responding to that. Houston says, you can't criticize the Aztecs. That's just presentism. And then Malcolm says, Aztec phobia.
Yeah, what's with all this Aztec phobia in the comment section? How dare you? How dare you?
They were very advanced for their time. Nowadays, we do it. We do abortion in clinics, and they did it in temples.
Yeah, yeah. You see, look how advanced they were. Don't
Yeah.
you get it? They were a couple thousand years ahead of their time, a couple hundred. They were ahead of the times for sure.
I once saw a meme where a woman says, "My body is a temple," and then this one dog responds, "Yeah, Aztec temple."
That's awesome.
That's genius. I've never heard that before. That's genius. Holy moly, that's great.
Yeah, the dark ones are always great.
And just so you know, Saeed says Muhammad, sir, was not a dog. Thanks for clearing that up, Saeed. We really need to know that.
Yeah, and he was definitely not a black dog.
Yeah, for sure. There's no chance he was a black dog that walked in front of people during their prayers. Not a chance.
And last point here before getting back to what you're saying, Malcolm says survival of the fittest does not need truth or goodness. The fact we have conversations about this shows we transcend mere materialism.
Well, yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah. I think the very fact that we're able, I mean, obviously from philosophy of mind, of which we have some really good options here, I would recommend Edward Phaser. Everybody recommends him. I do too. For philosophy of mind. His work on philosophy of mind is pretty incredible. He talks about, along with J.P. Moreland in his newest book on the soul, he talks about a lot of modern neuroscience research that goes into the strangeness of human thought as something which goes beyond mere material constructs. And so, yeah, I would agree. That's accurate to the modern research, that our abilities to talk about this foundationally means that we transcend the materialism that's otherwise presupposed. So that's good.
All right. So back to you.
Do I understand you correctly that you would say all animal behavior goes back to the environment, or the genes which are changed by the or differently enabled by the environment, and the humans are unique in that they have a soul or some other thing that is outside or beyond this natural effects?
Nearly right. So here's the difficulty, right? I believe that animals have souls. They have souls that are different from human souls. We have something called a rational soul, number one. Number two, when I say that animals are, all of their behaviors are able to be explained by pure genetics, which are thus expressed in variations in their environment, that's not me saying that necessarily. That's me quoting a large amount of, evolutionary geneticists and atheistic scholars and philosophers of science who would say that everything, kind of like Richard Dawkins would say and many others, who would say that everything would get simplified down to genes. Because any manifestations of culture, as we call it, culture is just the comportment, right? The collection of behaviors. And behaviors come from where? The expression of your genetics. So culture is just the expression of your genetics within a larger group. And so me saying that is not me saying that. It's me saying in an atheistic evolutionary accounts of reality, the distinction between culture and genetics is not real. It's not actual. It's just a manifestation of genetics. And so it's not me saying that. It's a great deal of atheistic scholars and evolutionary geneticists and ethologists who say that. And I would just say, if atheistic evolution was true, then that's what it would be, right? So I was just correcting the details on that. I would say, as a Christian, I believe that animals have a type of soul, and yet that soul is different from the human soul. And I would say that humans, though we can fall victim to the impulses of our genetics, we have a rational soul which allows us to transcend it. And so that's really important. People can act animalistically. Really important. But they can also transcend that animal nature, right? That impulsive nature that humans have towards certain evolutionary ends through the use and faculty of their soul, of their mind, which is a part of the soul. And so that's what I would say. I would say that humans are able to act evolutionarily consistent in a fleshly kind of way. As a matter of fact, that's usually what I think of when I think of the flesh. I just think of, like pure evolutionary functionality, right? You're just doing this for your survival and whatever's beneficial in that instant for the survival per your community. And you're able to transcend that through the use of your soul. So that's what I would say. I would say humans can reflect evolutionary type behavior that's consistent with evolution through simply following their flesh. But because of the uniqueness of their souls being made in the image of God, right? Humans have unique souls. They have this ability to transcend it if they choose to. Doesn't mean that all humans will, but it means that they can. Does that make sense?
Yes. Is culture part of the genes or part of the transcendence through rationality and other soul aspects?
As in, like, what I believe or what an atheistic evolutionary?
Yeah, the answer of the atheist is obvious. They say everything is nature. So
exactly. Okay, perfect. So at least we're clear on that point. So for me, I would say that culture is a real thing because atheistic evolution is wrong, right? Atheistic evolution is wrong because humans do have real souls that actually allow them to have behaviors different from their genetics and even different from what their parents taught them. People have free will and they have creativity and imagination. So they're able to imagine possibilities and make art of things. And so I would say that culture, in the way that we see it, makes more sense with the Christian view, in that we do have culture developing from the interplay between genetics and our free will and the other free wills of other people. And so I would say, in a Christian sense, yeah, you could have culture developing not just from genetics, but also from the free will decisions of people. which would be closer to what we call culture.
Yeah, that's something I would also agree to. But if we go back with those shared ideas to if we just have naturalism without mind, so assuming that was possible, then wouldn't it be possible to have culture which is shared? Some aspects are shared through all human civilizations because they share some code, DNA code, but they also differ in some way because it's not always the same. And the DNA is not always the same, and they differ because the interaction between humans, which is locally different compared to other places. Wouldn't you say that would be sufficient to explain the existence of culture plus shared moral laws overarching culture?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say in a humanistic, like evolutionary system where they're naturalistic, where there is no soul, then the question is not simply, is that possible to explain morals and culture, but is it possible to explain this reality that we see? Given the way that culture is as we've seen it in this world, right? As approaching it like an empiricist or something. Given how we see cultures in this universe as we see it, and behaviors and voting and the ways that people are even in their own culture with disagreements in their own system as we see it, I would say that just pure naturalism is not able to explain this system. Now, you could ask, but in theory, is it possible to imagine a world where naturalism, a purely natural system, led to people who, from their genetics, had shared basic moral laws because some conserved region of their genetics, the conserved parts are the ones that are less likely to be affected by crossing over during meiosis. Maybe the more conserved regions of their DNA somehow like kept certain moral intuitions and behaviors, but then the variant regions, the variable regions towards the ends, maybe those were altered more by their environment, and so they have different behaviors. I would say in that hypothetical universe, you could have something like that, but then the issue would be why certain behaviors are conserved and why certain behaviors are variant, right? Because then they'd all just be genetics. So I'd have to wonder, okay, well then why is it that some behaviors are conserved while other behaviors are, genetically variant between regions, right? Is there really something of value to these certain behaviors, and what's even the genetic mechanism behind certain ones being conserved and being put in a place in the DNA where they can't be affected and all the other ones? So I think in theory, I could imagine a world in which naturalism allows for shared behaviors. I don't want to say shared moral intuitions, actually. Instead, shared behaviors, because moral intuitions requires you to actually think about the thing you're doing instead of just doing it, and to think about if it's the thing you should do or not. And I feel like that kind of requires a type of developed consciousness.
But
So
you could say this moral intuition they derive from their action. So and their action
Sure.
are based from the genes. So that wouldn't be a problem in my.
Okay, so you're saying like the action happens first, and then they see that action and they try to justify it.
Yes.
Kind of. Okay. But that still requires like the thought that you need to justify it. Usually animals will just do something. They don't really feel the need to like quote unquote justify.
There is a difference because why we say cats behave different than dogs. So animals and species can have species-specific behaviors.
Oh,
which-
sure.
yeah.
No. I agree.
And I would
I'm just
say
saying,
that could be then the foundation. Humans have a species-specific behavior, and then they can draw their morals based on that species-specific behavior.
yeah, no, again, I hear you. But to draw morals based off the thing you're doing requires a type of introspection, self-reflection. I'm just saying, in a purely naturalistic system, I don't know if you would have any type of like introspection. I think you would just do things, and then your community that you're with would collectively punish you for it or not punish you for it, right? Like what we see with some types of bats, the vampiric bats that share blood if they don't get enough, and they're like, "Oh, you owe me some blood." So, which is a real thing. Some bats in South America. Yeah. One of my research projects back in the day, vampire bats have really interesting communities. Really interesting to think about. If one of them doesn't get enough blood over their evening run for some animals, and they're like, "Oh man, I'm hungry. I didn't get enough blood." Then some of the other bats in the community that got some extra blood from the night will actually regurgitate it into the one that's hungry. But then the moment that happens, the whole community kind of keeps their eye on that bat. And it has to, the next day, it has to get more blood to return the favor. But if it doesn't, then all the other bats will literally the next night, if it doesn't return the favor, all the other bats will push it into a corner. And then whenever it wants to get groomed and pet and stuff, then they'll keep on pushing it back into a corner and say, "Stop, get out of here, go." And they'll have to go where all the sick bats go when they get quarantined. And so it'll just have to like waddle there by itself, and that's its punishment. So we can't really say if there's any moral intuition there. All we can say is there's punishment or reward, punishment, reward, and that's about it. And so then the bat just says, "Must get blood so I can be reunited with community." And so the question of it being like good in a naturalistic system, just those intuitions sound like they require a type of advanced self-reflection you see with maybe a mind or a soul. And outside of that, I don't know if the kind of thoughts about justifying your behavior, like the bat doesn't justify its behavior. It gets pushed into a corner and it just sits there. And it's like, yes, I've done the thing where I didn't give blood. Next time I should give blood. And then that's it. You know, it's no real justification for behavior. Just does it or doesn't do it. And so I think it's possible to have an extremely simple form of behavior in a naturalistic system where you just have communal punishment of a thing that someone did. And if they have an advanced enough brain, they could say, "Oh, communal punishment of thing I did. Okay, me no do thing anymore." But otherwise, having some notions of like self-reflection or introspection about it, where it's like, "Oh, this is wrong for this reason," outside of like a utilitarian purpose, would seem very extremely unlikely in a naturalistic system. I would say it's extremely unlikely, and in some cases for self-reflection and introspection, physically impossible. Like material matter would not allow for that kind of self-reflection.
Yeah, I think I can see you, and I think this is the problem with atheism. You mentioned a few I also found. This last point you had was basically my problem I have is the human mind, intellect is a huge problem for evolution, because if we look at the time span of agriculture as human civilization, let's say 5,000 years, I don't know, I just threw out the number. That's a very short time frame in evolutionary term. And so we can't assume that the brain fundamentally changed in that time frame. So basically everything which is required for abstract math, quantum physics, poetry, rational reasoning, or whatever, all that stuff that had to be developed before agriculture, even though it was only necessary from agriculture onward. So
Exactly.
That's one of those predictive evolutionary development which only starts to have an effect after it achieved, and before that it was just a huge energy drain. And so that's one contradiction in evolution, in my opinion. Or another one you mentioned was You said it's specific to culture, but I think it's generally a problem. The entire model of evolution builds on random selection, and were experiments done that no, it's random mutation, not random selection. Sorry, wrong word. And the random mutation is assumed for the theory, but it is not. There were experiments where they found that certain regions mutate more than others, and there was even I've heard even of a paper where they found that bacteria, when they are in a very dire situation, for example, if suddenly the water gets very polluted, then in their last moment they just ramp up the mutation rate by a lot, and then they hope that at least one of the members of the group manages to luckily get a good mutation which enables them to survive in that. And so how does that protection and mutation area, how is that done? I don't think there is an answer to that from the atheistic perspective. And there is also, and also if you have there are other points which I won't go too much into that. I think that's an interesting topic, but I agree with you that evolution, or I think evolution doesn't make sense. It's not possible to explain even the survival of species over hundreds of thousands of years. I think that's not possible with what we know about evolution. But yeah, if we assume that there are unknown mechanisms which would allow it to work, then I think culture would be possible. Especially because suddenly the human mind made a huge leap in intellect, and now it's way more advanced than the other animals, so we can assume more advanced cultures than which would be observed in animals. So that's my summary of this question, and I think it was relevant for this entire argument which I had here. Basically, the argument on the stream is not really the important one. And then let's go to the next step. You said that some objective moral laws exist. Why would love be one of them?
So some objective moral principles do exist,
Yes.
right? And objective moral laws. So this actually was a slide on that presentation where people said, okay, maybe objective moral goods exist, but why would that have to be love? It's actually why I made a slide that says, well, a law could be good without being love. So love would simply be desiring the good, right? Which kind of by definition is what we see in every single culture, where they say you should desire the good and reject the wrong, right? You should pursue the should and reject the should not. So the pursuit of the good, which is foundational to all cultures, in that they say, well, what we sense and feel to be good should be pursued, and the thing that we think is dangerous or improper, even if we like it, the thing that's dangerous or improper, we should reject. That is what love would be, right? The pursuit, the desire, which leads to the pursuit of the good. So in that sense, if we agree that there's objective moral laws, then we would have to agree that love is a reality that exists. Because objective moral laws say, follow and pursue the good. Love is the desiring and pursuit of the good, the desiring of the good. So if objective moral laws say, you should pursue the good, and love is the desiring of the good that motivates us, then by definition, if there's objective moral laws, then there would have to be love, because love is the desire for the good, and moral laws call for the desire for the good. If that makes sense about what objective moral laws are and how love is the motivating force behind that.
Yes, I think if you use that definition of love, then I can accept that. And then we would say there is a form of, there is a love with that definition, which is objective, as in we see it in all humans. And then if there is a God, then he would probably also have shared that because it seems to be an objective moral good. So
Yes. Yeah, that's a pretty good summary.
that's the point of this slide. So the points I actually wrote down, they were not that representative of the question,
Yeah.
but we yeah, that's why it's not just written. So
Alright.
now let's go to the next slide, and this is basically the definition. Yeah, it's your definition of love. Now was love is the desiring and pursuit of the good. This is not. Okay, I will skip this slide. Let's go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and in the following argument you used, or in the previous here, you used in premise 9. Love is willing the good of another person, willing unite with the good of another, and that is a different definition than we talked about as the objective moral good, which is love, where it's just the pursuit of good and not willing the good of another person. So how do you jump this gap? And where
Yeah.
am I now? Here. And here, this is very Merriam-Webster dictionary. Yeah, and there your definition is point 4a, unselfish, loyal, benevolent concern for the good of another, such as fatherly concern of God for humankind, brotherly concern for another, and 3. Okay, no. 4b is not relevant anymore. So this is an American dictionary, which means it is biased by Christian values. And so how did you, but it's just one of the many definitions of love. How did you come to the point that love is the willing of another good is a premise and not just love is the pursuit of the good?
Well, to will in the philosophical sense is, that which moves you, right? So willing philosophically and even neurologically speaking, willing is that which moves you after something, right? So that's what willing is. So to desire or to will the good, to desire the good, is the motivating factor that moves you to pursue the good. And so that's why if you go forward, I think one slide or something.
Backwards, I haven't. Yeah, forward. So this is.
Yeah. Right. So
this one or
between P6 and P8, kind of like between those two slides is basically what it was. It was just those two. So just as we talked about, from that purely philosophical approach, where we just talked about how if objective moral laws exist, and objective moral laws call you to desire and pursue the good, and love is the willing, which is desiring and pursuing. That's what willing is. It's desiring and therefore being moved to pursue the good. Then from premise 6 that we already talked about, where the if objective moral laws exist, then love must exist. Then according to that definition of objective moral laws, that which tells you ought to pursue the good, reject the evil, and love is the desiring and pursuit of the good, then without any reference to the Bible at all, from premise 6, we already explained if objective moral laws exist, then love exists as an objective good.
Yeah.
So if you go to the slide after this, the Merriam-Webster one,
yes.
Now you can see that I didn't look at any of these when I talked about the definition of love, because although, yes, 4A would, I guess, apply, but I didn't actually look at any of these because I thought about it purely from that objective moral law premise that we talked about from P6 and P8, premise 6 and premise 8. If objective moral laws exists, then the desiring of objective goods, which is part of the objective moral law, the desiring of those objective goods exists. And objective moral laws exist, therefore love exists as an objective moral good. And so one expression of that desiring or in pursuit of the good would be willing, which again, willing is desiring, therefore pursuing the good of another person, another thing, another factual, intelligible substance or reality. So that would just be one expression of that reality that we already logically broke down from the objective moral law slide before. And so why did I use this definition? Because the fact that this definition is used by Thomas Aquinas and many other philosophers, even atheistic philosophers, which is quite interesting. I believe I saw, who was this? No, he's not atheistic. He just sounds like it. He's somewhat universalist sounding, but how am I forgetting his name right now? Something Wick or something like that. I'll have to check again. He was an interesting guy. I'll have to pull that up later in my philosophy of religion textbook. But love is willing the good of, or just willing the good. It's the desiring pursuit of the good. So love, more properly, is loving and willing the good of another thing, another substance, another intellectual or intelligible, object of your intellect. Love is willing the good of an intelligible object of your intellect, which would include a person.
What is an intelligible object?
Yes, yeah. An intelligible object is in something that your intellect can recognize as in some way distinct from you. It would be one aspect of love. And since we already previously affirmed that God is the perfect example, then we already know that whatever form of love we're going to be talking about has to be the perfect exemplar example that we would look at in humanity as well. And so saying love is willing the good of another person is the exact same. It's just an expression of the definition I already gave, which is love is desiring and pursuing. It's willing, it's desiring and pursuing the good of another. Now I can put person, I can put thing, place, object of the all of these things I could put after because they would all just be objects of the intellect. Objects of the intellect. But because God is an agent with intellect and will, then he would have personal love, right? And so love as a personal agent would be willing the good of another agent in its most perfect sense, another person.
So I'm going to jump in here real quick. Well, two things. One, David, you originally said that you might want to end by 5, which is a half hour from now. So if that's still the case, we'll need to make sure that we move towards wrapping it up. But I did want to say that there was a poll put in the chat about what animal was best. Dogs have won a narrow victory over cats and elephants. For that, it was a pretty close vote overall, but dogs were the winner, not with a majority, but at least with a plurality. And in honor of Jam AB, who's been in the chat telling us how horrible pork is, I'm going to put up a new poll of what your preferred main entree is, or what pork kind of meat you prefer. So we'll see how that comes out here in a second. So go ahead and continue on with what you guys were discussing while I set that up. Just keep in mind that we do need to wrap up in a half hour or so.
Yeah, we can. I'll keep that in mind. I won't ramble on too much.
Yeah, no, I think it's good, the rambling, but I think we should probably do another stream to finish the presentation because we are at slide 19 of 36. So.
Oh, yes, definitely. Hey, right about halfway. That works out well. So, yeah, I'll just, unless there's something like directly related to what you're talking about, I would suggest definitely covering that. But otherwise, I'll just take a couple things. Audience...
I want to finish this point
yep.
stream, but you can first do a bit of audience interaction.
So go ahead and continue your thing. I'm busy setting up that poll anyway.
Yeah. So you said love is willing the good of some things. For example, an electric chair would also be a thing, and so would you say let's say we take me as an example. I'm not eternal, and so God is not essentially loving me eternally, because it's not an attribute of God to love me eternally. Why is it required as a necessity that he loves a person but not an object like a chair?
Well, I don't know if I'd say that it's necessary that he love one and not the other, but he does have to love in some sense actually, right?
Yes.
So that's the important part. He has to eternally be actually loving. That's one word I did notice I left out of my original argument, which is too bad because I even mentioned in my cool graph that he is pure act. So whatever we say of God essentially, we also have to say of him actually. As in, it's not like he is potentially loving. He will potentially be loving this or that, but that he will actually, he is in some sense actually loving, the object of his intellect, the thing that about which he thinks. And so since all those things in his, mind, all those things which had not yet been created, would be these things which he truly loves because he knows them in himself, we still would have to say, okay, but how is he actually loving? In that he is actually loving things that are not yet actual. Well, he could actually be loving things that are potential and at the same time actually loving a thing that is actual. And that actual would be another person, one who could reciprocate the love. Because if the love is reciprocated, then we have perfection, right? The fullness and completion of perfection, which is another quality we already talked about, the full satisfaction of those attributes of God. But then understanding the full satisfaction and perfection, that's why a lot of my premises sounded redundant, because I kept on calling back to a prior one to remember how all of these work together. The perfection of God would require, or at least it would make sense in the perfection of God, to have some sort of love that is not just, actual on God's part and potential on ours, because we're not actual yet, but that he also has love which is actual on his part and actually being reciprocated, which would then be the completion of love, right? Of a personal expression of love. For love is not simply, desiring the good of another, but also intellectually knowing, but it is to be loved by another. And so in God, this thing must in some sense be perfectly actual. Perfect and actual, which means perfectly actual. And that would be possible by another person in whom love could be perfected. Because again, it's not just that he's eternal and immutable, but also actually in some sense what he is, which would require another person in order for him to actually, eternally, immutably be loving.
A comment here from Justin for some clarification. Love is desiring the good of another. Is that not the same as the definition I mentioned before? Love is the involuntary reaction to the virtuous. It says the virtuous to virtue. But just to say, I think it's the virtuousness of others. I think is what he said before.
Yeah.
So how is that? How are those two definitions different?
So that's great. I think just reading them can help quite a bit. Love is desiring the good of another. Desire is a matter of will, and so you can actually choose to desire the good of another, right? Love is desiring; it's choosing to pursue the good of another, to pursue the good as is. Saying love is the involuntary reaction of the virtuous to virtue is quite literally the opposite, right? Because love is desiring, right? Which desire in a philosophical sense is a choice. You can choose to desire and pursue. Love is desiring would be a matter of will, saying love is the involuntary reaction. Involuntary means not voluntary, which means not a matter of will, which means uncontrolled, incontrollable. I think love is a thing that we are commanded to do because love is a thing that can be commanded because love is a choice. You can actually choose to love. You can choose to desire the good of another. So maybe it's better to say love is the willful desiring of the good of another to make it more clear, versus love is the involuntary reaction of the virtuous. You can also initiate love. So love is desiring the good of another doesn't, by definition, have to be a reaction. But in this person, the atheist philosopher's definition that Justin mentioned before, where they said love is the involuntary reaction, that reaction makes it sound like it's a purely responsive secondary act, instead of it being potentially a principal act, the thing that begins a relationship. And so I think that's, these are actually very different, both in the matter of will and the matter of cause, right? One is dependent, the other one can be dependent or independent. One is freely willed, the other one is involuntary. So I think these are not at all the same definition.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So Benrix, did you have anything else you wanted to cover today? Or should I take the audience questions?
I guess we could go to the audience questions and continue with that topic next time.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think this is probably a good place to end it for today. John raised a very good related question, which I have no idea the answer to. Anyone have any idea how many times love is mentioned in the Bible as opposed to the Quran? And I think that would be a good study to conduct and figure out. Now, keep in mind the Quran is much shorter than the Bible, so you would have to adjust for that for it to be fair. But I still think that the Quran is going to reveal something very telling about the Quran, about how little it talks about this topic.
Yeah, because think about it. I mean, even the Shema says, "Shema, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord with all your strength, with all your heart and all your mind and all of your strength." So, and that's echoed over and over and over and over and over throughout the Old Testament, that prayer, the Shema. And then, of course, we get to the Psalms. And the Psalms are constantly talking about the steadfast love of the Lord, just like it was in Exodus and Leviticus. So that's an interesting question. I bet it's quite a bit, because love is constantly commanded. Like it is a constant command, which is interesting. But yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so we have this comment, which I'm going to take as a question from Cargo Crew. The concept of Abrahamic religion is not correct, in my opinion, because God should make humans realize things in such a way that he doesn't require any rules. What I mean is, if all the Bibles are lost, then what? So I guess there's a question there. The question boils down to, does Christianity make sense? And, forget about Islam. We don't care about them, right?
Yeah.
Does religion make sense? Does our religion make sense if without the book of special revelation? And David probably caught why I worded it that way, because the traditional belief of Christians is that there are two books. There's the book of nature and the Bible, the book of general revelation that's available to everyone, and the special revelation of God. So can we determine, can a person, thinking deeply, right, and carefully, determine everything that the Bible teaches? Well, no. Can they determine the things that are necessary for salvation? I would say absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think this question or statement is kind of confused, in that they're saying these are not correct in my opinion, because God should make humans realize. So he should make humans realize things in such a way that doesn't require any rules. But now you've implied and made a rule for God. you're saying God should do this without any rules, and the way he should do this is by making one rule. And that one rule that God should make is that he makes people realize things. So number one, I'm kind of confused as to what's actually being said because it sounds inconsistent in that it's implying a rule that there should be no rules. But then they say, what I mean is, if all the Bibles are lost, then what? To this point, we get to general revelation, which I, of course, agree with Thaddeus, that you can have, according to Romans 1, verse 20 to 22, where it says for, creation has shown and displayed, has made known the invisible attributes of God, namely his eternal power and divine Godhead, so that all are held accountable, right? And so I think that's Romans chapter 1, where it says that. So I would agree, along with Thaddeus, that, we have general revelation that gives us these general concepts of God, his eternal power and divine Godhead.
There's a couple comments along this line that would be interested in that study, potentially interested in doing it themselves. So I will put it on my potential to-do list, but keep in mind there's lots of things on that list. So if someone else wants to do the work and get the raw data, I would absolutely be open to either having someone on to discuss it if they want that, or doing a video based on the data someone provided to me, and giving proper credit and all. But that way, if you don't want to come on, you wouldn't have to. So I think that I suspect that it'll be a very powerful conclusion. So if someone wants to pursue that, I definitely encourage you to do so, and I will make it available to the subscribers of the channel one way or another. So some funny comments. Protestant believer says Allah makes all the gold and silver, but needs a loan. Yeah. Very, very.
They're not allowed to take loans. Isn't that haram to take loans or something?
Allah
Yeah,
is.
but Allah can. Allah can.
Oh, that's right.
And if you're in
his
heaven, you will
wisdom.
probably be able to do it too in heaven. Because
You're right. That's true. In Jannah, you can do everything that you couldn't do on Earth. So everybody's probably taking loans out in Jannah.
So I'll say this, and then we'll come back to it after a super chat to give us a second to respond. Akron earlier said Muhammad rejected a bribe. He also rejected the Bible, but he rejected a bribe to stop preaching Islam, even though he wasn't rich. I suppose this is supposed to be some kind of argument that Islam is true. So what we think about that, we have a super chat from Hariel.
If you frequently say it, Allah would pay off your debts. So you can refer to it back again, inshallah.
So Hariel says, and our friend there says you should repeat this over and over again. The Mank, Mufti Mank, is a lunatic. God bless Reason Answers, brother. Thank you very much for that donation. So there's a couple of ways we could respond to this. And I did respond to Akron in the chat a while ago, and I don't think he's listening anymore. But I want to put this out there to the audience as well. Either Ben or David, you're welcome to jump in and give your thoughts on this, and then I'll give a couple of my own.
Ben, you want to take this one, or should I?
No, I don't have anything specific to say.
Yeah, it's not a very good claim the person's making, so I feel you.
But it is some argument, I think, because greed is something which motivates some people. So if you can exclude that as a motive, then it's worth something, I guess.
Yeah. In a vacuum, that would be worth. I mean, the way they've set it up, it's not an argument so far, but just a proposition. They've just created a claim. But in a vacuum, you could say, okay, that, or in an argument more developed, you could say that's an argument if you can give evidence that he was otherwise not greedy. That being said, because he pillaged and stole things from people and took plunder during battles, then I would assume that you could actually say that Muhammad might have rejected a bribe to stop preaching Islam, but he sure didn't reject the war booty he got whenever he would take over a caravan or a village. And so, you know, he won't accept a bribe, but he will kill an entire family to get their treasure. That's cool. So the claim does, you know, that Akron is making doesn't really hold up too much if it's meant to say that he wasn't motivated by money in any instant. How many wives were included in the bribe? Excellent thing to add. And so it looks like in the rest of his time there as well, right? Like maybe he's like, I only want, they're only offering me one wife. That's not fun. And she's so old. She's 12 years old, right? I'm not going to go for that. I need a young one.
David, that's why I wouldn't go with the number of wives, but the value of each wife in black slaves.
Yes, yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, let's see the let's see the quality. Let's see what's going on with each of those. You know, the number of black slaves he had and how old his little wives would be, because some of them could be really old. They could be 13 or 14 years old. Muhammad thought he was truly a prophet early on. He realized he was a false prophet and didn't care. Well, I guess that's like a lot of Dawa people who realize that a lot of their arguments are false, but they kind of just don't care. So, you know, that makes sense.
Yeah, like, you know, Ali Dawa saying that the scientific miracles have been debunked and that's why he became a Muslim, but it's okay because now he believes without evidence, so he doesn't need any evidence anymore. And thus it's all good. But Mary points out, you know, another possibility is that he actually believed what he was saying and thus didn't take the bribe. That doesn't mean that he's a true prophet. It just means that he's sincere. Being sincere, I would say, is necessary to be a true prophet, but it certainly wouldn't be sufficient. Lots of sincere people believe wrong things all the time. There's also the aspect that the bribe might not have been sufficiently large. He might have thought they'd get more money by continuing to preach Islam. And then there's the fact that where do we get this story of him rejecting a bribe? Oh, yeah, from Muhammad, or at least allegedly from Muhammad. We get it from sources written about Muhammad hundreds of years after he died, claiming that Muhammad said that he rejected this bribe. So was there even a bribe to begin with, right? Did someone actually go and say, I'll give you this if you stop preaching Islam? Or did Muhammad just make up that story to make himself look legitimate? All kinds of possibilities, so not a good piece of evidence.
In case it is actually a good story, an accurate story, I think the most likely, like a speculation, I don't know the context of the story, but it is a very strong honor and shame culture where being in debt and causing others to be in debt was a huge part of your social standing. So I think that's more relevant than if he was greedy or not.
Yeah. That's a really good point, actually. I didn't even consider the cultural aspect there. Nice. That's true.
So Professor Yaffel says, who ate the apple?
I think that's wrong. Why do we talk about apples? We should talk about aquadates or not.
And then Breakfast Gun also triggered the Apple animation. So I put in that I would read them as if they were super chats. And Artemis just fell off. I had to catch her there. So if you caught that, what happened is she just rolled over in her sleep and fell off the edge of my desk. So now she's all like, what's going on here? What's going on here?
That's awesome.
Snoopy said, you're going for apostate prophet marathon style. You got this all wrong. AP goes for reasoned answers style marathon.
Come on
style.
now.
I'm the original. Well, actually, Adam Seeker is the original. I got these long streams from him. He inspired me to do them, but got to get your ordering right. I got to get your ordering right.
I don't know why you talk about long streams. I mean, we are not that long in. It's only 3 hours and 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. This is lowballing it for Thaddeus.
It's a YouTube short.
This is a YouTube short, yeah. This is what people watch on their way to like work and stuff, you know, their little drive.
So Houston says Allah doesn't pay interest, so it's okay that you give him loans. Except all those prosperity hadith teachers are saying that when you give your loan to Allah, He'll pay you back many times over. So I don't know. I don't know how
But that's not interest. That's just many
exactly.
times over.
Yeah, he's just
That's
generous.
true.
That's all. He's just
yes,
generous.
You're right.
It's unrelated to the original investment.
Mary agrees that AP is totally imitating me.
You can tell. You even got a blue background.
Yeah, and as we all know, whoever has a blue background is very nerdy, according to David. So, so Jeffrey, a legitimate comment here. Love presupposes two things: that good exists and that there's a personal existence outside of your own.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I mean that is factually true. If you accept the premise of love, then you accept the premise that goodness exists and that there is a personal existence outside of your own personal existence from which love could be directed. So that's fair. I think that's a very interesting way of saying it. I like that.
In my slide, the one I had on but we didn't talk about, I used a self-invented definition of love. And there I wrote, wait a second, I want to quickly go there. Where is it? I'm almost there.
No worries. No worries.
Oh,
No.
here.
So Rick said I had to watch 30 seconds of commercials. Yuck. Well, I apologize about that, Rick, but there's nothing I could do about that. YouTube's going to show the commercials regardless of the monetization status of a channel. In one case, they share the revenue. In the other case, they keep it all. But they no longer don't show ads on non-monetized channels. So, all right. So I pulled up your slide.
Yes, love is willing to go towards that which is good. So the Bible explicitly states that God hates sin, and so I'm aware that sin is not a person but an action or a mindset or whatever. But still, I think in the previous comment you highlighted, I would add the third premise that those persons are worthy of love as well. I mean, that's a Christian assumption that every human is made in the image of God.
That's actually really interesting. Okay, so in order to maintain God's justice, that he's being like fair in his judgment, you'd have to say that the other thing is worthy of love. Which I guess, in theory, the only one actually worthy of love, of God's love, would be God. Which then could also act as an argument for the object of God's love being God actually and eternally and immutably. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's a argument I will make next time. But I thought it was worth pointing out with that comment before.
That's great. That's actually really interesting. I can't wait to talk about that next time. I like that.
Justin says he has to go, and Artemis apparently had to go as well. She just walked away. Everyone's leaving because the stream is coming to an end. He says it was a good discussion. Thank you for answering so many of my chats. Good job, Ben Rex. And I think it was a very good discussion. Yeah. I think things went very well today. I hope the audience found it to be beneficial as well. I do have, looks like 3 more comments that I want to bring up. First, a super chat from Hariel.
Brothers and sisters, why to lose this great opportunity? Remember, when the person is on his deathbed, the last minute, he will ask Allah Jalla wa Ala to be delayed for 1 second to do what? Not to pray, not to do other things, but to give sadaqah. Because sadaqah, you can give it just like this, in 1 second.
So Hariel took that 1 second to make a super chat there, and she will not be sad, maybe.
By the way,
on the Day of Judgment, yes.
With that super chat video, I always think of the city in France, which is called Toulouse. So why Toulouse? It's always.
There's a connection there. You see,
Yes.
you
Yeah,
see, it's
that's
a
a very
prophecy.
Hariel says a small gift. God bless. Thank you very much for your support. Professor Yaffle says, today I've been on the top leaderboard, the continued leaderboard, the most spent, and now even the most earned. Has that ever happened to anyone else before? I feel proud. I have no idea. I don't like pay super close attention to it. I do keep an eye on it to make sure that it's still running and hasn't crashed or something, but I don't generally like memorize who's on the list. If it's so great, then he should fork out some cash to the congregation. Yeah, he should take his own advice, right, and be donating to get all those benefits from Allah.
Bismillah. That's right.
And Mary says, I just had to scrub cat poop off my shoes.
Oh, okay.
Did you use a Quran? Just asking.
You, Mary, we have an agreement.
No, I think she should use an uneven amount of stones.
She follows the hadith very closely, don't you see? She follows very closely.
Then one other comment that I want to briefly address from Masi Muslim. Muhammad was a prophet, and this is the proof. He was given the revelation that followers of Jesus will be superior, and that prophecy turned out to be true.
Superior in intellect, or
maybe it was the women's rights. Maybe that's what showed that he was actually a prophet, or maybe it was the 5 pillars of Islam, where they lie about their beliefs constantly, or because in the women's rights in Islam, this proves that he's a true prophet, because he says that you have to cover up women because their bodies are naturally too dangerous for men to look at, and otherwise, they're half brains, right? So you have to protect them because they're too dumb to think for themselves, or maybe this one where they talk about the concept of God, where they say there is none greater than the Creator, and yet for some reason, all the things that the Creator forces people to do, because there's no free will in Islam, he calls people to do these evil, awful things, and then supports his people when they do it. No, I don't buy your Allah. I don't. I really don't.
That's awesome.
You see, you have to understand the metaphysical reality which is behind Allah, which is nothing except for his 2 hands. Yeah, Jordan Peterson talking about Allah would be a great thing to see.
I have addressed the substance of this comment before. Obviously, Masi Muslim is not a conventional Muslim. He believes in some combination of Islamic and Christian teachings, but this isn't a prophecy at the time of Muhammad. In the 6th century, the 7th century, Christianity is already superior, right? The Christianity is already dominant. The followers of Jesus have already become uppermost, at least in the parts of the world where Muhammad would be familiar with. So he's making a statement. He's making a claim that this is the proof that Christianity is true, but it's not a prophecy. It's a statement about the existing reality at the time that he lives.
I have an argument against Islam. Please ignore the fallacies. Allah is not God because you can buy him, and that means it is possible to have an equivalent amount of money. Yeah, David got my argument.
That is actually, that's actually not bad. That's not bad. Because you could say, since God by definition would have to be infinite in value, and Allah apparently can be bought by people, then you actually could make an argument out of that.
Yeah, I know it's a false equivalation in the buying aspect, but yeah, ignore that.
Yeah, we don't have to worry about that. It's a law we're talking about.
Yeah.
Fine.
So Mary did confirm that she didn't have a Quran handy, so she had to use a toilet scrubber. Such a shame.
That's what they call those odd number of stones. Toilet scrubber. English is weird. I'll never understand how they get these words.
Asif says Muhammad can only be a prophet if he is with the crucified Christ. Paul said churches will have first apostles, second prophets, etc., etc. So unless Muhammad affirmed the crucified Christ, which he did not, then he can't be a true prophet. Finally, I had this individual here, Kadayani, Azhar, Nawab, Mirzai, Ahmadi, say Kadayani Islam is the only true Islam. Sorry, that was not from him. And the only true Muslims. And Mirza Ghulam Ahmed Qadiani is a prophet of Islam. Very interesting proposal there. Why don't you take this opportunity to email me, thaddeus@reasonanswers.com, and let's have a discussion about your beliefs that obviously only represent a fraction of 1% of people who identify as Muslims, but that's okay by me. I'm very happy to discuss anyone regardless of their beliefs. So here's an opportunity, right? You won't have an opportunity on most Christian channels to talk about your beliefs. You won't have an opportunity on most Muslim channels to talk about your beliefs. So let's have that chat, and very friendly. You know, if you're friendly, I'll be friendly back. And we can see if your version of Islam holds up to scrutiny, since you say that other versions don't, but your version does. And finally, Phil says, don't use the Quran to clean crap off your shoes because there are holes in the narrative. And that wouldn't be a very effective scraper.
It would. It's like a sponge. Feels so good.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right, so
Gee.
that's all I have for us today. I'll be back tomorrow to be talking with Imran, another non-conventional Muslim, who believes that contemporary Islam doesn't represent the teachings of the Quran or Muhammad, and that contemporary Christianity doesn't represent the teachings of the Bible. So tomorrow, previously we discussed why he thinks that Islam has distorted the teachings of the Quran. I happen to agree on that. Now, I don't agree that the Quran is a valuable source or anything anyone would go to, but I also agree that Islam isn't really based on the Quran. And then tomorrow we're going to be talking about why he thinks that the Bible teaches something different than what Christianity does. And he went to the low-hanging fruit, or at least what people think is the low-hanging fruit, and says the Bible doesn't teach the Trinity. So that's what we'll be discussing. I will be defending the idea that Scripture, specifically the Gospel, Torah, and Psalms, because that's what he believes in as a believer in the Quran. So I'll take that restriction. Obviously, the case would be easier if I could refer to the epistles and the prophets as well, but that's all right. I'm happy to do it with just the materials that he has made fair game. So I'll be defending that Christianity is correctly interpreting the Bible as being a Trinitarian book. He will be suggesting that it is a Unitarian view of God. So that should be a good discussion. He is smart. He is very respectful. It should be a good conversation, but it should be confrontational. It should be the opportunity for the end of my career here, right? Because I don't know what arguments he's going to bring, and I do think that he will bring better arguments than Muslims typically do. But I believe the Bible defends itself because truth defends itself. So I am willing to take on that challenge. And then finally, as far as the immediate upcoming things, Mary will be back on Tuesday. We will be discussing whether or not Hamas accurately represents the teachings of Islam. So it should be a fun one. And I did just realize that I hadn't given the results of the poll. So beef won overwhelmingly this time. Beef at 47%. Pork at 25%, chicken at 18%, and fish at 7%. I do agree from a pure taste perspective that beef is the best. I was kind of expecting people to pick pork just to annoy Muslims, but I agree with the results of the poll there. All right, so until we meet again, God bless everyone. Take this information, use it in your conversations with non-believers. God bless.
Adios.
Goodbye.
Mm-hmm.